All right, guys, before we get too far into it, I wanted to say hit that subscribe button if you like what we're doing here and want to see this thing keep growing. If you want to help the channel, help all of us get the best guests we can possibly get, hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. It goes a long way. Let's get to the video. So let's get into it. Today's guest, guys, freaking cool. Jason Heffner. Man, he's been on the forefront of all kinds of Lambos and like, 20 years of development on Lamborghinis and pushing the envelope with drag racing, half-mile racing, street cars. I feel like you were doing it when it wasn't as easy, which is cool too. It seems now that almost any shop can just get an R8, buy a kit, and just suddenly they make twin-turbo R8s now.
There are a lot of options available. When we did the first Gallardo in 2004, the consensus was that this is a terrible idea. This thing's never going to survive. The owner of car number one, he lived in Riverside, California. And throughout the time we had the car, everybody's just telling him what a bad idea this was because in their mind, they're thinking of like the quintessential Lamborghini, right?
Yeah.
That you wouldn't drive it farther than you wanted to push it back.
Yep. Like a Countach is just arguably one of the worst cars you can just try to just drive around.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's, cool to look at, but a huge disappointment to experience in reality. So, this customer, to prove the point, he came and he flew into Tampa and drove the car back to Riverside, California.
Wow.
Stopped a couple places along the way, met up with a couple of the naysayers, gave them rides in the car, and it took a couple years to really prove to people that this was there was viability to this. And
so I missed, what year did you say that was?
That was 2004 when we started. Would have been 05 when he picked it up.
So the cars were new too at that point. Like they were.
It was a brand new car.
Just out. It's not like, 5 years of Gallardo and then.
No.
Wow, that's crazy. That's how was your anxiety on that drive back? Or
well,
were you just confident?
it was. I was super worried because I knew everybody was watching.
Yeah.
I had driven the car like a limited amount. I did a reasonable amount of testing on the car, but it was the first one. I had no way to know that this thing is going to make it to California.
Yeah. So what kind of power was that making then?
At that point, that factory car made 400 to the wheels. Mm-hmm. And outside of that car, on most cars you dealt with, if you put a supercharger on and you picked up 100 or 125 horsepower, that was a pretty meaningful gain.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was shooting for. But we made the first dyno pull, and the car made 650 to the wheels, so it picked 250 up, and I thought, oh my God, like this thing's got to be making 15 pounds of boost.
Yeah.
But it was making 6. So, that was my first encounter with a really efficient 10-cylinder variable valve timing engine, and it was pretty amazing. And to combine that with all-wheel drive, so it actually put the power to the ground at low speeds. That really put a smile on my face.
Yeah, because, even in 04, 05, like the cars that were comparable to that in any way, like modifying, like people weren't really, even turbo cars then weren't as common. Now you go to the drag strip and every car's a turbo car, but even that alone was probably less common, right?
It was.
What kind of turbos were you running? Like, what was the technology like?
On that car, I'm pretty sure we had a 62 millimeter Turbonetics turbo. Turbonetics, right?
Yeah. That was a brand. That was a brand people ran.
Right.
I think Precision owns them now, but they just don't do anything with it.
Right. There was a guy out there, Greg Orlando, that I had known. He, worked for Vortec, before, and I knew the guy, so I thought, well, I can count on him to steer me in the right direction because, turbos were, like you say, they just weren't as common. We did superchargers for a number of years because it was what people knew. It was, it was just easier to work with. But we did our first twin turbo system for a Viper in maybe like 2002.
Okay.
And after the first test drive on that turbo Viper, I was done with superchargers, right?
Yeah.
Never again.
You just gave it up right there.
I mean, you just can't even explain how much better it is in every way, shape, and form.
Especially because a car like that could spool the turbos so efficiently versus like a V8 LS at the time maybe that you tried to put too big of a turbo on that's old, probably couldn't really spool the turbo just as efficiently as a big tractor V10.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Viper engine, the very first Viper system, we put two GT35Rs on, which seemed like, I mean, going back to the Mustang days, I saw...
Would that have been a Gen 2 Viper then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it didn't try to kill you as much like Vipers do? A little more tame?
It was a handful. I mean, it was a driver's, it was a car that required driving, and mental preparation to run the car. The first Turbo Viper was for a guy named Sal Patel.
Still known in the Viper world.
You probably know who he is. He came in, he had a really nice Quicksilver Supra, said he wanted to sell the Supra and do this Viper. But he was the one, he says, I can't have a supercharger. It's got to be turbos. So I thank Sal for steering me into the turbocharger market.
Is that because of what he knew about the Supra? He was like, the turbos are just so good. Maybe it was a single turbo Supra, and he was like, it's just so much better. Because a single turbo 2J back then is just, that's great.
He had a really nice Supra, and Sal is a very intelligent person. I mean, especially considering he's on the consumer end of things, right? I mean, I would say that Sal, he absolutely knows more than many shop owners would know. So, I was very fortunate to, come into contact with him and be able to work with him and build this car. And, it changed the course of what we did with cars from that point on.
Yeah, you became a turbo shop at that time.
Yeah.
And then probably a few turbo Vipers, and then the Gallardo comes out.
Yeah, it's some, by the time the Gallardo came out, we had developed a reputation for being able to accomplish things that others couldn't, or at least being not afraid to try.
Yeah.
In maybe 2000, I had a guy from Canada call, and he says, well, he knew me through the Viper world, and he says, well, I've got this Diablo Roadster, and it needs boost. It needs to be faster. And he says, well, if I ship it down, can we make a twin supercharger system for this Diablo Roadster? And I didn't even have to think twice. I just thought, yes, send it down. And I had never worked on a Lamborghini before. I don't know. That might have been the first real Lamborghini I had even seen.
Oh, wow. And that was still down in Sarasota at that point, right?
That was in Maryland.
Okay, that was when you were still in Maryland.
Yeah.
Okay. So not as common. I was going to say in Sarasota, you probably would have seen a few Lambos by then.
In Maryland, a Lamborghini would have been like a UFO sighting.
Yeah.
They did not exist.
Just crabs and crab cakes.
Well, it was
Old Bay.
where I grew up, or where my shop started. It was like a very much a car town. Every weekend, we'd spend Friday, Saturday night out, chasing street races around somewhere. Everybody was into cars.
Ocean City is still very well known for their car scene. They do that Ocean City.
The car cruise.
Yeah, and they have to shut it down every year because it's so crazy. Maryland's got a deep car culture of that kind of stuff. So,
absolutely, it's got a pretty vast, like a wide variety of like car aficionados. You get to like Southern Maryland, like heading toward Ocean City. You may find like more of the old school muscle car guys. I can't even imagine what the car cruise weekend looks like in Ocean City now.
Yeah, well, because it's an interesting spot because Maryland has a lot of tourism, so they get good money, and then they have a big fishing, so like people have money in their pockets in that kind of area.
Yeah.
It's a relatively wealthy area.
I guess I hadn't thought of that really.
So
like it.
The car community can thrive there.
Yeah. And I guess it depends on what part you're in. I mean, like I grew up, I spent most of my life in College Park, and when I opened the shop, we were in Glen Burnie, which was, closer to Baltimore. And, cars was just what people were into there.
Mm-hmm.
We had Capitol Raceway. We would rent Maryland International Raceway at least once a month, go out there and just run cars. But
great track.
yeah, it's a phenomenal facility.
Yeah, and it's been in their family for so long, too. They've ran, like, Jason Miller and the Millers have had that track, right? I'm thinking of the right track.
Yeah.
MIR.
Oh, yeah.
World Cup, yep. They've ran that for so long, and such a good track, but as you're saying, sorry.
Yeah, we would go there and we would take cars and run numbers that nobody believed. Mm-hmm. I mean, it could be 40 degrees outside. Jason would have that track like hooking like nails, and it was not uncommon to have a DA that was, more than 1,000 feet below sea level. So cars made power. The track worked. It was always worthwhile to go out there.
That track is like a perfect storm of location, weather.
Yeah.
It's just like the DA is why that track gets so amazing.
Absolutely.
I've seen negative 1,200 there many times, and we're just like mind blown because we don't get that down here. Even though it's so low on sea level, we just don't get that.
No.
If we do, the dew is going to be so bad that you can't even race anyways.
Yeah, it makes it hard to compare what we run here versus what somebody runs there, because out at Bradenton, like, we are very blessed to have Bradenton Motorsports Park.
Yep.
I mean, that is absolutely one of the best tracks that I've ever been to. Wade does like an unbelievable job making that track work. So it's we're not without a good track facility, but there's nothing Wade can do to bring that DA down to Maryland altitude density.
Yeah, it's like adding a nitrous kit to every car.
Oh, yeah.
When they show up in Maryland, it's like every car has a 100 shot now.
Yeah. It can be, I've had to like explain it to many people. They'll tell me like, well, look at this guy. He went out and ran this, and look at, you ran this. I'm like, well, okay, you have to understand why it's not exactly apples to apples here, right? If people haven't experienced like the different altitude densities, the different tracks, like you just don't know, like they don't know what it's like to wake up in the morning, pull out of your driveway with a negative 1,000-foot DA and feel like your car is making boost, like, even though it doesn't have boost, right?
Yeah.
You get to the end of the street and you're like, man, this thing feels good today.
Yeah, you see it in Florida, like, one day hits 60, and suddenly, where did all these nice cars come from? People are just driving them out, like somebody would think, now every car has boost, but all of a sudden, like, your wife's car that's a 4-cylinder turbo is, like, all peppy all of a sudden.
Yeah, this thing just wants to go.
Because everything has boost now. I mean, they kind of have to. Even, like, I was just driving a new... it's like a Lincoln Navigator with the twin turbo EcoBoost, and I'm hearing turbos when I'm flooring, and I'm like, what the heck kind of Navigator has a turbo spool noise?
Yeah.
It's just weird. So you were deep into the Huracan stuff, or I always say it wrong, Gallardo. I always say Gallardo because I
don't know whether it's Gallardo. Gallardo sound like, like
us Americans.
It sounds funny to me,
Yeah. And then the Murcielago came out too, but I feel like that never really got touched by people trying to modify stuff.
I never really cared to do them. Like they were, the Murcielago was more of an Italian car, right? The V12 cars didn't really get the total redesign. I mean, the Gallardo was created after Audi acquired Lamborghini, right? So that car was designed by Germans from the ground up.
Yep.
And the Murcielago was still very much an Italian car. And Italians do a phenomenal job, like incorporating a soulful feeling into a car, but they fall short in the engineering department.
Yeah,
right?
you need the utilitarian German mindset of it works is why you do it, not it feels good.
Yeah, so the Murcielago, we did a twin turbo Murcielago, and we took it out to the drag strip, and it's a manual transmission car that's all-wheel drive that weighs 4,000 pounds.
Yeah.
And it's so hard not to break things or burn the clutch out of the car. There's nothing about the car that's serviceable. It quickly became apparent that these V10 cars is where it's at.
Yeah, they kind of and they made so many V10s that it wasn't really reasonable to, chop up a Murcielago, and they are so good the way they are, whereas like the Gallardos seem like they need it, but like the V12 high revving Murcielago with the gated shifter is just like a great example the way it sits almost.
Sure.
But then like, I don't go, we were talking about this the other day, Gallardos are weird because you don't even see them anymore. It's only Huracans now. Yeah,
the 5-liter Gallardos especially, those engines had some oiling system problems. They're not super fast. I mean, they're almost anemic. They have no bottom end. Mm-hmm. They sound fantastic. If you merge the exhaust together, it gives you that real high pitch, high revving, exotic sound. But they're not very fast. They have oiling system problems. The engines fail, and it's kind of hard to fix them because they're not really fast enough for people to crash them regularly to get the engines out of. And the engines grenade much more often than people crash them. So like, I'd have guys call and they say, well, I got a deal on this Gallardo, and, maybe they paid, at some point you could buy one for $80,000. It kicks a rod out the side, and the dealer wants $70,000 to fix it.
Oh, so it just totals out your Gallardo,
right?
Instantly.
So, I've thought about, what do you do with these cars now? Because, what's the point in doubling down and putting the same engine back in the car? Like, it seems like a great candidate
like
for...
a gutless engine.
Yeah, it seems like a great candidate for an LS or 2J swap, or just put something else in it. It's a fun project car.
I have seen quite a few of those now. They are popping up pretty heavily. The couple 2J ones. I guess that also comes down to transmission though, because that's the big elephant in the room on those cars is E-gear or gated manual, right?
Yeah, you would have to go with the gated manual. Even if you could make the E-gear work, about that time Ferrari came out with what they called their F1 transmission.
Sounds really fancy.
Sure, right? And I had encountered people that said, "Oh yeah, that's this has got the same transmission as the Formula One car." And I'm like, yeah, okay.
It's a good talking point.
Right.
Some marketing guy really nailed it on that one. Listen,
sure it does. It's just like what Schumacher drives, right?
Schumacher?
Yeah. So, when in reality it was a synchronized single dry clutch manual gearbox that was like electromechanically controlled, right? Or
what car would that have been in the Ferraris then? Like not the Testarossa, right?
The 355 would have been the first, and then the 360, and the Gallardo had it, and it was neat. It was like a novelty thing to be able to, I can shift with the paddles. It's not an automatic. It's more engaging.
Yeah, you have to start the car. You have to roll from a start, using stuff, right? You can't just drive it like a normal auto.
Well, the earlier Gallardos absolutely required some human interaction to make the car tolerable to drive.
That's
right?
so weird. For an auto car.
Well, you put it in gear, But to take off, like, it did a really poor job at engaging the clutch and modulating the throttle. So if you just stabbed the gas pedal, the clutch would grab, and you'd start jerking around in the car.
In your auto car.
Right. But it's not an auto, right? It's
it's an E-gear kind of auto.
I tell people, like, think of it like this. Like, think of it as you're driving a manual transmission car, but the guy in the passenger seat is doing all the gear changes, and you don't know when he's going to do one or like how he's going to do it. Like, go try that, and that's the e-gear experience.
There's just an Italian guy not paying attention, just kind of like, I guess now.
Right. Wait, were you shifting now? Like, what?
Yeah. So the gated manual is what you want.
Absolutely.
In a Gallardo. I mean, it's what you want in a Mercy also. The gated manual is what makes them so great.
Yeah, and that transaxle is really commonly used. There's a lot of kit cars that use that transaxle. It's really easy to get adapter plates to adapt that trans to many engines.
Yeah.
So that kind of sorts that out. So you can buy an adapter plate to bolt it to an LS, a 2J, probably whatever you want.
And also, from what I've seen, adapter plates are pretty simple just in general. I mean, people make them for any car. I've seen anybody with CAD now. Right. You can scan both sides of things, and you can have an adapter plate made fairly quickly.
Yeah, as long as you get the input shaft centered in the back of the crankshaft, and figure the flywheel out, you're pretty good to go.
Especially on the auto cars, like my 2J adapter plate is so simple. It's just a thick flex plate, and you're good to go.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of companies that they do pretty well manufacturing these swap components. I mean, it's as you know, it's fun to do, right? I mean,
why deal with the motor that came in your car when you can have whatever you want? Because all in all, like the Gallardo, like it's a cool looking car. Like it's a nice looking piece, and Lamborghini did good on the fit and finish. But then when it came to like the nitty gritty engineering of making the motor good and the trans work and everything like that, and ECU seems like that's where they fell short.
Sure. I mean, it was a lot to take on, and they still had quite a few of the like old Italian components when the Gallardo started, and they moved more away from Magneti Marelli, more toward Bosch, and by 2009, when the Gallardo LP560 came out, it was almost exclusively Bosch electronics. The engine had been redesigned. Of course, they got rid of the even fire V10 that sounded magical and made it an odd fire V10 for God knows what reason. Like the Germans thought it sounded too good, right?
Yeah. Huh. They needed something that sounded a little bit different than whatever the Italians thought was they had to change something. They probably just they couldn't let the Italians have anything.
I feel like the engineers won out on that. There's some microscopic amount of like vibration that is eliminated with the odd firing pattern, and at the cost of all the good noises.
Yeah. What a shame.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what a car sounds like is, it's a significant part of like what makes the driving experience enjoyable. And not that the Huracans sound bad, they just don't sound like the 5-liter.
Yeah, it's the same with like the V12 stuff. Like the V12 they're always magical. In every car they've ever been in, there's always something so great about that V12.
Absolutely.
In like the Aventadors, in the Murcielagos, in like even like what has it? A couple of isn't there a couple like Aston Martins that have it too, like a high revving V12 or something crazy, or V10.
And those things, they sound so angry, like like the cold start of most of those V12 cars, like it's pretty menacing sounding, like it just kind of gives you goosebumps when you hear it. And I hear them ripping around Lakewood Ranch sometimes, I mean, ever since they finished off, one of the roads around here, like I can hear people ripping cars up and down the street from the backyard. And
yeah, we're in this spot where they built all these roads, and then the houses come 2 years later. So
Sure.
they're nice roads and there's no houses. So you're like, well, there's not children playing at the moment because it's a construction zone.
Sure.
So you're not really doing anything too risky there.
No, and, I feel like as long as we're, as long as people are sensible with it, it's less of a problem. It does seem to me that, like, as life goes on, everything gets more populated. Cars keep getting better, but it's harder to really find ways to use the cars, right? I mean, you don't, when I moved down here, I mean, this whole area, there was nothing around. We drove down from Maryland and tried to find Home Depot and, made a left, on a university, and it's pitch black as far as the eye can see, right? But there
was no mega mall there?
Well, they didn't have the, concessions or the golf course, but there was a really nice straight road that went all the way down there and all the way back, right? Mm-hmm. And nobody around to care what you did there. But, then they start developing the community. The people that buy those houses, they don't want to hear it. And, it comes to an end, which, I feel like, obviously, I mean, we're super fortunate to have Bradenton Motorsports Park.
Yep.
But it's not exactly feasible for car guys to be at the drag strip, every time they want to go have some fun with a car.
Of course. I mean, that's the problem is too, like, not everybody's going to, like, do that every time. Like, most cars probably break now if they tried to launch on some of that prep.
Sure.
So some people just want to, like, rip it down the road a little bit as you're driving to work, and I get that, but I try to keep from putting too loud of exhaust on my car, which is always a good route as I get older. I want it to be quiet so it doesn't sound like I'm going 90 when I'm going 40.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like Teslas, they get a pass, right? I mean, you could have a Tesla that runs 8s, and you could be making an 8-second pass from one traffic light to the next every single time the light turns green, and nobody cares. Nobody looks, right? It doesn't make a sound. So
those scare me more because they're so heavy.
Yeah.
They're, 5,000 pounds and they're going 8s from light to light. Like that's like a wrecking ball. Like that is a heavy machine to be doing that. Like if my truck was doing that, people should be scared.
Right. I think what's even a little more mind-blowing to me is that, thinking back like to when I started playing with cars, like I'd imagine we all started off with something that probably ran like 14s. And, when I was 16 and I bought my Mustang, they would not let me test drive that car off of the dealer lot because that 225 horsepower car was so fast, I was guaranteed to crash it, right? Nobody could drive that car without wrecking it. And now, like, I could go buy my daughter a Tesla that runs low 9s at 150-something, hand it over to her, and, the only qualification is that I just need to be able to write the check.
Yeah.
Which I feel like there should be, I thought that when the McLaren 720 came out, like, how could you just give this car, like this thing, it's borderline a weapon, right? To just some guy that has no idea what's going to happen when he puts that pedal down the first time. I
love that car.
Oh, yeah.
They're so good.
I just don't know how. I mean, like the chassis have progressed with them. The brakes are even more amazing than the engine and the chassis.
But you have to use them.
Right.
You have to be prepared to like stand on them. And I think some people don't like, that's one of the things you learn in like, if you're on a racetrack with like somebody teaching you what to do, they're like, if you're going to hit something, stand on the brakes. And I think not like people aren't really told that much, like just driving on the street. Like if you're going to crash, hit the brakes as hard as possible. I think that's something you learn when you drive a car fast, but you don't learn when you just like drive a fast car on the street.
I think, when you're dealing with a car that accelerates the way these cars do and they brake the way they do, it's probably important to understand vehicle dynamics, right? Because if you've got a car that's accelerating rapidly, you just can't come off the throttle and smash the brake pedal, right? I mean, you need to understand like how and why you want to transition smoothly from acceleration to braking, and because you can get into just as much trouble,
standing on them.
Yeah.
I just meant if you're in like an emergency situation, like people are often scared to just like.
Well, they panic. They're not. I mean, some of these cars are fast enough to make people start to black out with the acceleration.
Yeah.
Which makes them ill-equipped to respond in the event that somebody pulls out in front of you, or a deer, runs across the road or something like. So yeah, I feel like, probably makes sense to have these cars set up with the way I set our cars up. We set everything up with different modes, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it can make this. You don't have to use it like that every time. Go down, start off on this mode, get used to it, Wait until you feel like you want more.
Yep.
And then, go from there.
I was racing a twin turbo R8 one time, roll racing it, and I was out on him. I started to like pull away from him, and he told me later, he was like, I was trying to reach for the mode selector to turn up the car while he was driving. I was like, we're going 170.
Yeah. I've had one customer, like
he's like reaching for it down wherever it is, probably in an R8. I don't know. It's probably somewhere under the dash, like hidden a little bit.
It depends on who builds the car. Like I said, I don't like to put, it's going to sound really odd for me to say, but I don't like aftermarket things, right?
Yeah, especially in a car like that, like factory interior.
I don't like things that look aftermarket. I don't like things that feel or operate aftermarket. So all of our map switching is just done off the cruise control switch.
I think that's how he was doing it. He was trying to do it off cruise control.
Yeah.
That may have been it.
Which is a bad idea to fumble with that while you're mid-race going 170 miles an hour, right?
Scared me a little bit
when
I heard it. I was thankful I was a little ahead of him when he told me.
Right.
I was like, so you're hitting cruise control while you're going 170?
Well, the problem is like you're not looking, I tell people like you want to look as far ahead as possible. Like look at the end of the shutdown area when you leave the start line, not the tachometer or the cruise control buttons, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
some of those cars are a little scary too because, in like when I see a car in like a 275 radial, I kind of assume they stepped up to that. Like you started off like something light and now you're kind of worked your way up. Nothing against those owners, but they could just write the check for that car. 2,000 horsepower. I mean, you could do it for a drag car too. It's just it's less common.
It's very unlikely.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Well, and also, if you're going to build a drag car and you're going to participate in some NHRA-sanctioned drag events, you probably are going to pass the NHRA licensing requirements, right? Which, it's not like it's a 3-day driving school.
No.
But, somebody says, okay, go up, run it to the 8th mile, shut it down. Let us know that you know where the 8th mile is, right? Mm-hmm. We want to witness you run this car down here and make sure you don't scare us to death before we say, like, it's okay for you to drive this. But
yeah.
I feel like very few people probably have or have had an NHRA license anymore.
I'm guilty of not having one, but I have a box of 200 time slips
right
there, and I always just like, I just have to pay the money at this point, which is it's just give money to NHRA for the license. I have a chassis cert though now, but
sure,
it's just you can buy right in. I mean, if you see me do my burnout and stage my car, you probably assume I know what I'm doing a little bit. But then the roll racing, you can just floor it. You don't have to really.
Well,
it's a little different of barrier to entry, I think.
You made your car do what it does. So you understand how the car works and you understand what to expect when you're operating it versus like, anymore, a lot of people, like if you're sending the car off and you're just going to get it back and it's going to be transformed into this, 2,000 horsepower rocket.
You may fly into the track. You may not even actually touch the car until you get to the drag strip. I've seen that a lot too.
I've done that. Yeah, I've had that happen.
And I get it. I get it. I mean, I would do the same thing. I think you should show up to a test and tune and run a bunch of that, but I've seen that too.
Yeah, I mean, I've built cars for plenty of guys that when we get to the drag strip, I then find out that they've never set foot in a drag strip before, never seen a drag strip before. Yeah. And I encourage them, like, you know what? You should go rent a Mustang and take it to the drag strip. And you should know how the drag strip works, because it's overwhelming, you know, to have never been to the drag strip. You've got, you know, what are the lights? Like, where do I stop? You know, how do I get back? Combined with, I've never used this car before in this trim.
Yeah, that's
right.
A lot.
It's a lot to take in.
Yep.
You know, so, and then there's no rush. It doesn't have to be like, we got to do it all right now. You know, just, you know, could walk your way into it. And
if your first pass is going to be in the 8s, you're going to get fairly bored fairly quickly of drag racing, because that's the progression. You skipped all the progression. Like I'm sure your first pass was 14s, 13s, 12s. Like my first pass, same way.
Yeah.
If I was put into an 890 car, I mean, stock motor R8s are going 790s now.
Yeah.
If you're put into that on your first pass down the drag strip, you're going to get bored.
Yeah, what do you have to look forward to? I mean, I feel like it's, you know, and to each their own. Like, to me, like, I have an appreciation for what it's like to cross every one of those barriers. Mm-hmm. Because, like, I beat my head against the wall trying to get, you know, to get through every one of them. Mm-hmm. You know, it seems like a little, you know, like that 7-second time slip, it seems like a thing, like, you have to earn that, you know, like, you know, if you want, you can dive in and you can do it.
They're buying your knowledge. When, you know, when they show up at your shop, they're paying for what you've already busted your head up against the wall, you know, weeks on end to do. And that's fine too. I mean, I bought knowledge from Induction Performance when I got my engine from them and the tuning that Alpha did on my car. Right. I didn't have to struggle through these rods don't work with that, or like, I bought knowledge in different ways. Same with my trans builder.
Right.
I didn't have to deal with the R&D.
Yeah, there are certainly like some things that you don't want to have to, there's no sense in you like making these discoveries because someone else has already discovered it, right?
Yeah.
Save yourself the trouble. That's the point of going to someone like Induction or myself, right? But, you know, it's like, you know, to some degree it becomes like a cheat code on a video game, right? You know, well, I can enter the cheat code, go right to the end of the game, and then I'm done. Well, you know, you never want to play the game again after that, right? You know, so, I mean, to me, I feel like the challenges associated with, you know, reaching these milestones, like, you know, most of the enjoyability has been like just going through the progression.
Mm-hmm. So also there's the flip side of this. I've seen some shops where they have a customer that wants to be the one to deal with these barriers with them, and he'll drop off a car and be like, I want to do this kind of together, where he kind of helps fund the R&D. And like I saw it with Giddy with his GTR. That was kind of how it went. Like he kind of funded the R&D that put that car from like 7s to 6s and stuff like that, but he didn't, you know, he wasn't the one wrenching on it every time. But it's a customer shop owner team at that point, which is kind of a cool way to do it as well. It's
super cool. I mean, it's next to impossible for a shop to fund and finance like an effort like that all on their own.
Yeah.
And stay in business at the same time, right? You know,
because you can't just go to the track, you know, 5 times in 2 months or 3 months just testing and beating on a car to find those tenths.
Well, I mean, the point of all of this is to develop things that customers want so you can provide the customers, you know, like, you know, the problem is customers want this. You solve that problem by providing it. So, you know, it's an ideal situation where you have a truly passionate customer combined with a capable and equally passionate shop, and you can accomplish a lot together, right? You know,
my first experience with seeing you guys was actually at the half mile with OB Prestige.
Yeah.
At the time, you were helping them on all their cars, or I don't know what the relationship was. I just remember these chrome cars rolled out, and I was like mind blown. I was like, this 3 chrome cars that were just twin turbo. There were Huracans at the time, which were still not as common to see, I felt like. and all twin turbo deals. I was just like, wow.
Yeah, OB and his guys up there, like, they had a really, really great bunch of people, right? I mean, they, like, really, like, enthusiastic, very, very happy to be, able to do the things they want with the cars.
He seemed like he just loved racing.
Yeah.
Like he just loved that car and going fast in it.
Yes.
From what I saw.
Absolutely. I mean, he was just he's a guy that's, OB is a guy that he's passionate about everything that he does. Like he goes into, everything he does, he goes like full excitement, full enthusiasm. So it was really great to be able to work with those guys. The half mile racing at some point, it just gets to be, I guess one of my issues with the half mile events is they're not racetracks, right? And I feel like the half mile events were initially brought about because guys didn't want to go to the drag strip and break the cars. They wanted to go somewhere. They didn't have anywhere where they could run the cars, to the top of fifth, sixth gear.
Yeah, you can't stretch the legs on a Huracan anywhere but a half mile, really.
Well, I guess really like it started with 1 mile racing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we used to go to the Texas Mile back in like 2000, in the late 2000s,
Was that like Ford GTs at the time?
Right.
That's the car for it.
So, in 2010, we built a Ford GT that went 266.9 in a mile. Wow. Which that was super fast.
Yeah.
I mean,
it took until recently to beat that, I think.
Well, there was another. So we took that GT out, and there was another guy named Mark Heidecker in Texas that he told me, he said, "Look, I saw that car, and that inspired me to do my car." Right. So he went on to continue with the mile racing until maybe a couple years ago, and they actually went 300 in a 1 mile Ford GT.
Oh wow. And where was that? Weren't they using NASA for that?
No, that was in Texas, I think,
Okay.
at the Texas Mile, I'm pretty sure.
Because recently they just did one with a Ford GT on the NASA deal.
Right.
And I think that was more than a mile, though. They were just going for like a mile an hour.
Yeah, the Cape Canaveral facility, like
Yeah.
it's pretty unbelievable, right? I mean, I think there's a maximum of a 1/4 inch deviation in elevation from across like 3 miles or 3.5 miles, right? It's maximum 1/4 inch deviation. It's all concrete and it's grooved. So like we've been out there and had it rain, and like the grooving in the concrete, like the water runs away. It's dry in 10 minutes.
And the groove kind of helps probably keep the car just going straight, or does it just like...
It's like kind of like, it's almost like stamped like the rumble strips, so they go like perpendicular to the car.
Okay. Huh.
And I kind of feel like it, concrete works a ton better than asphalt to begin with, but...
Sounds expensive, the NASA facility.
Yeah. Plus they keep it clean, they keep it dust free. Mm-hmm. You couldn't ask for any better
low elevation, surface. Good DA-ish.
Yeah, it's probably
sea level at
better
least.
Than it is here.
Yeah. Yeah, because I just saw they recently broke that record again with a Ford GT as well, and it seems like the Ford GT, I don't know if it's the engine and trans combo is so good for it with the gearing setup, or is it an aerodynamics thing, or is it just kind of a mix?
Well, the gearing in that car it's absolutely suited for running very high speeds. We've done a ton of turbo Ford GTs, and if you raise the rev limiter on one of those things, like a stock transmission on stock tires goes 180 in fourth gear.
Oh, okay.
Right?
That's a lot.
Yeah. So, like a stock Ford GT comes through a 1/4 mile in third at 130 something miles an hour.
Horrible drag car then.
It's not that it's hard to 60 foot that car, and that's why you don't really see those cars like really doing the half mile events. Like it really shines with like the extra distance.
That's weird to build a consumer car like that. That needs like, once you're going about 200 is when this thing really shines. Like,
Well,
that's crazy.
when Ford came out with the GT, as it was explained to me, the reason why they did the gearing the way they did, they really wanted the car to 0 to 60 quicker than the Z06. So the car had to hit 60 in second gear, right, to be able to get that, to get the 0 to 60 they wanted. If they shortened up the gearing and it hit 60 in third, it killed the 0 to 60, and it was slower to 60 than the Z06, and they just couldn't have their flagship car not be the quickest.
I mean, that would be pretty embarrassing to not have that car. All
Sure.
that it is, because, I mean, C6 Z06s, or is it C5Z at that point?
Well, it would have been like 2006, so that would have been a C6.
Yeah,
right?
okay, that makes more sense. But
Yeah.
still, I mean, a very consumer car versus like
Right.
this flagship Le Mans winning
Sure.
heritage car. Like, you got to have it beat that.
Yeah, and the Ford guys, I mean, you can't even like, it's hard to explain like what a great job they did on that car. I mean, it's what is that thing? How old is that now? 2005,
Yeah.
15, 18-year-old car. And if you drive one today, like nothing about it feels 18 years old, right? I mean, it drives super nice. I mean, that engine with the supercharger, it's very torquey. The car, like it, drives really tight. And those engines and transaxles that came in that car are bulletproof, right? I mean, like you could, we made 2,400 to the wheels with a stock block and put it through a stock transmission.
Yeah.
And never broke the transmission.
Those cylinder heads are very sought after, too.
Yeah.
Like the GT cylinder heads are like the ones you want if you're doing Mustang stuff, too.
Okay.
For those modular motors, because it's all a modular motor at that
Right,
point. It's
right.
not. It's no crazy motor that you don't find anywhere else. Like, it's just modular stuff.
Yeah, I'm surprised to hear that with the cylinder heads, because they have really large ports. That engine was designed to be coupled with that positive displacement supercharger. So there's not a lot of like intake or exhaust velocity because of the port sizes. So it really doesn't work. It's not ideal for a turbo application. But if you want to make really big power, the heads will move a lot of air.
That's what I've seen with it, because when we were doing the Crown Vic, that was what we wanted, was the GT heads with the positive displacement VMP blower. And
Sure.
it made good power like that. And that was what I remember was an expensive part, is buying GT cylinder heads. And I remember looking at them and it said Ford GT on it, and I'm like, holy crap.
This is super cool.
I was
right?
like, that's really cool. Like, is nobody paying attention how cool this is? Like,
I would have thought the bottom end would be more desirable, like with that thing being a factory dry sump engine. I mean, like the dry sump oiling system seems like it would be valuable to have in something.
probably so expensive to justify.
Yeah.
Buying cylinder heads, everybody, that's so cool. Buying a dry sump, nobody ever
Yeah.
thinks that's cool.
Yeah,
That's like that dreading, like, oh, I gotta get a dry sump for it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you grenaded your standard modular 4.6 or 5.4, like you could probably go to Copart and find another and put your heads on it. But if you scatter something and take out a Ford GT aluminum dry sump block, it's probably upsetting.
Yeah, that's
right?
probably a bad day.
Yeah.
So you were pretty deep into all the Ford GT development then for
Oh yeah.
those applications. Did you think it was going to be a little bit more mainstream than it was? Because like the Lamborghinis became so mainstream, but even roll racing at Bradenton, and FL or TX2K, I've never seen a Ford GT roll up to roll race, which is surprising to me.
Well,
There was Mullet. I think that was the guy.
Jason Stevens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was like the guy. His car was like always crushing it from what I've ever seen.
That guy always had a good time. He was fun to be around. I remember, he had the gold-plated intake manifold and turbo system, and I don't know. Yeah, I remember he came out and did Texas Mile a couple times. I saw him out there. But so, I I've always been a Ford guy. And, you know, when I was a teenager, you know, I met my wife when I was 17. Like, you know, we you know, as we're growing up, like I'd see pictures of that 1966 Ford GT with the Gulf livery. And like,
Yep.
I always said, you know, I mean, that is the best looking car I've ever seen, right? I mean, the thing is just gorgeous.
It's hard to deny that.
And she said, you know, that color combination's awful. You're right. You know, so,
The orange and the teal bluish.
yeah. So, you know, like, you know, I always had Mustangs. I was always into Fords. And, you know, Vipers was what we were doing when they revealed the Ford GT concept car in 2003. And I called a couple of my friends and I said, listen, like, we have to go to the Detroit Auto Show. Like, I have to see this car. Like, I mean, I can't believe they're going to make this thing. And, you know, we went out there and I thought, well, this Viper is gone. Because when the GT was announced, they said this thing's going to be a $90,000 car.
Oh, yeah. I mean, at that price point,
right?
They would have sold millions of them.
So, you know, it comes out, it's 170. Dealers don't even want to sell them. And, like, it almost seemed like, well, this is never going to happen. You know, like, I mean, dealers don't want to sell them. It's a, you know, I mean, a $200,000 car, you know, in 2005. I mean, that was.
Yeah, they're putting it next to like SN95s and New Edges, and
sure,
it's tough. It's tough to put those two next to each other.
Yeah, I mean, but it was, you know, but the interesting thing about the Ford GT is the people that it attracted, right? The Ford GT attracted one of like the best groups of car guys that I've ever met, right? It's guys that like, they understand what this car represents. They understand what it pays homage to. They as well, you know, they fantasize about that car their whole lives. Not everybody can go get a 60s GT40, right?
Yeah.
And even if you got one,
you're not going to drive it.
You'd drive it once and you'd realize you don't want to drive it a bunch. You know, so I guess like comparatively speaking, to be able to get this and it's a drivable car, and at that point, like only $160,000, right? You know,
yeah.
I say only like, you know, kind of sarcastically.
And way ahead of its time.
Yeah.
In all aspects. Like now we look back and it's comparable to some current stuff, but at the time, I mean, that was so ahead of its time.
It was remarkable. And, you know, the guys that bought that car, like, I mean, I had customers that had 7 of them, right? Like just every time they'd see one, you know, I like that color, let's get it. But almost nobody knew that they had 7 Ford GTs. Like they weren't buying these to get anybody else's approval. It's just like it was for them. Like everything they did with the car, they did it for them. So, you know, it's a pretty unique group of car people that is like what I would consider like the core Ford GT group.
It's always been cool to me, too, that they just slapped a Ford badge on there, too. Like, they didn't try to do anything like, you know, like, they didn't try to make it like Supercar. They just put that blue oval.
They didn't try to rebrand
right
it
on the hood. They didn't
you know,
try to make it anything crazy. Like, they're just like, it's a Ford. It's like your F-150. Like, because they could have done that. Like, even the Mustang has very few, like, Ford badges all over it, but they just slapped a regular Ford badge on that thing.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about, like, the various manufacturers and the special cars that they've come out with over the years, I mean, I think it's hard to argue that Ford has done probably the best job with the special vehicles, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, who doesn't love a Fox body, right? I mean, I know there's guys that don't, right? But secretly they do.
When you see one done up right, you can't not like it.
Right.
You really can't when they're done right.
Yeah.
And some of I've seen like Fox bodies with the IRS swaps on them. That's always cool to me. Like there's no Fox body that you can kind of do that's not cool. Like the IRS swaps on them is so cool too.
But, you know, if you think back over time, like Ford, they did the GT90 concept, you know, as a V12, you know, rear engine car. I mean, it never became a reality, but, like cars that did become a reality, they had the 93 Mustang Cobra R.
Yep.
I mean, super cool car.
Yeah, that orange, it like
Yeah.
that's like burned into your brain if you see that car.
Yeah.
And then like the Mistachrome,
Yeah.
GTs that they had, what were they, the Terminators.
Yeah, I think the Mistachrome came out on the 96 Cobra.
Yep. They did have great, all the SVT stuff is good. The Lightnings are still so like, people talk about the Lightning as that one time that Ford wanted to make a cool truck. And it took until now for GM and everybody else to start making cool trucks.
I mean, they did 2 generations of Lightning, like the earlier ones with the 351, like it was cool. I mean, definitely didn't have the potential that the supercharged Lightnings had, the second generation trucks. But what else do they do? All of the Cobra R Mustangs, the Ford GT. Mm-hmm. They're coming out with this new Mustang GTD, which impressive. It's hard for me to like find much enthusiasm for a $300,000 Mustang.
Yeah, and I feel like I feel like currently they don't know their audience that well to be like, look, it does road racing, and I'm like, yeah, but like,
right?
How many people like? Corvette's kind of in the same boat. They're like, it's really good on a road course, and it's like, yeah, but like, how many people are road coursing their cars? Like, I know Sebring's local to here, but that's about it. Maybe you go up to the firm, like. There's not much road coursing in Florida, and that's probably a big part of their market. And like, I don't know. It's a tough sell.
Guys that reference the Nürburgring time,
that's crazy.
Like kind of makes me chuckle a little bit because, like, are you going to Nürburgring and turning laps in this thing? Like what's the difference between you and the guy that did the Nürburgring lap time, right? It's not like the car autopilots itself around Nürburgring and. Year after year, I feel like the cars keep getting quicker around there. Largely, in part, the rubber compounds and the tires keep getting better, and suspension technology. But I mean, all the
Michelin
things
over here doing a new Pilot Sport Cup that's just so much better or something.
Sure. So like I kind of feel like I mean, everybody has their reasons why they gravitate toward a certain car, and I can't fault anybody for that. Like. But to me, like I grew up, we had drag strips, and like the quarter mile is like, that's the measuring stick, right? Yeah. That's the unit of measure that's like universal. Every week, this is a drag strip, and every drag strip, they're always a drag strip. The timing equipment, it stays there, it's surveyed off,
The driver's not as important, because that's always my question when people are like, look what it did on Laguna Seca. But I'm like, yeah, but like the driver is so much of a variable there. On a drag strip, it's not as much of a variable. On a car with launch control and just goes down, like you're going to eventually get it close to what they're saying it will do.
I'd be more impressed if like somebody told me like what they did at Laguna Seca, right? Yeah. Like I'd say, man, you've got to be like an incredible driver. It takes immense talent to pilot a car around that track and put that lap together. But, the car, it's like, it's the tool that you use to do it with.
Yeah. Because I'm not going to do as well as somebody like Randy Pobst, who they probably put in the seat of that car.
Right.
To go do that, who knows every corner, probably where every single rock is on some of those turns and stuff.
They absolutely do. I mean, they put... they know exactly every braking zone, every turn, every corner entry point, where you open up, where to shoot for on the apex.
I do like to follow Pikes Peak a little bit, because I think that race takes so much guts to do what they do, and to see them doing that, I do like following that as much as like...
Absolutely.
As far as like any road racing-ish, I mean, it's more of a time trial, but that is what I would like to follow over anything. Well,
the Pikes Peak, it seems more like privateer driven than manufacturer driven, right? I don't see, and I could be wrong, like I don't follow it super closely, but I don't think that General Motors or Ford Motor Company has a Pikes Peak hill climb team, right? They
They avoid that, I think.
Right.
I think that's a little too much liability for them.
Yeah.
Some executive would be like, we're doing what? No.
No.
No shot. That's the last thing they want is a Corvette going off Pikes Peak for all the photos.
Oh, man, that would be, that would be terrible to be involved with something like that.
Yeah,
But,
of course.
so,
But they all know the risk. All those drivers know when they're sending it that edge is right there.
Absolutely.
And the snow up at the top when you get up there.
Well, just, I've been out to the Pikes Peak hill climb, and 1 week I was out there. Pikes Peak is incorporated into like Speed Week. So, and all throughout downtown Colorado Springs, they had all of the hill climb cars like parked, in the streets for everybody to look at. And, to get to walk around and see all of these different types of cars. I mean, like everything from like electric powered cars to like a semi truck with a compound turbo setup on it.
Yeah.
Like just the innovation and the thought that goes into these things it's really exciting to see. And then, somebody has to make those vehicles work, right? I mean, they have all the things on them, but like the control strategies on the car are like really exciting to me. Like to be able to take all of these components and make it usable and like operationable in a manner that you feel safe enough with to send a guy up a mountain, knowing that, if your traction control or anti-lock strategy doesn't work right, like this guy might not come back.
Yeah. And the elevation change for a tuner is crazy. Like, we start at 1,000 feet elevation and we end at 10,000 or something crazy, whatever it is. It's like, that's a difficult thing to be able to do wide open throttle on a car too. Like you're just sending it in that elevation change.
It's very hard to test for or prepare for, right? Like, because like normally you would either set a car up for the conditions at the bottom of the hill or the conditions at the top of the hill, right? But how do you make a car that's like, it's prepared to deal with like this wide range of elevation, temperature, like you're standing at the bottom in shorts and a t-shirt and there's snow at the top.
Yeah.
Right. So, how do you set up a car to deal with that? And the driver has to like take that into account as they're making their way up this mountain.
I think, funny enough, a factory Aero 911 Turbo S placed top this year. It just had a cage in it.
Sure.
Like I kind of got a kick out of that because I've always told people just how good those cars are when you drive them, and it's just funny that car was able to get up it as fast as some of these cars with like a wing that's like 20 feet and like a lip that goes 2 feet out in front of you. It's like,
and I feel like the real differentiator there is that some of those cars are far more capable than the mind of the driver could comprehend.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, these cars now, like they perform beyond comprehension.
Yeah.
I told my son one day, like when this Motec package came out for the Huracan, one Sunday I said, hey, you should come to work with me today. I'm working on some stuff. Like, I think you'll think it's pretty cool. And so I was working on launch control and rolling anti-lag. And so we're out in front of the shop and like, I kind of explained to him like, all right, here's what I want the car to do. Here's what I've done to try to make it do it. We launched the car and we're running this thing through the gears toward the end of the street. And I hit the brakes and, I know what the car is capable of. So it's, I'm not out there like putting me, my son, or a car at risk. And I look over at him and he's like kind of out of breath. And he goes, what the heck, Dad? I said, well, what? He goes, well, we're accelerating. And all I could think was, there's a turn up there and we can't make the turn. So why are we still accelerating? And then the car just stopped, right? Like he goes, how did it stop? How did it stop like that? And I'm like, I wasn't even trying, I mean, you wouldn't even believe what these brakes can do in this car. But it just goes to show, like, who has probably put more time and money and effort into traction control and stability control management than Porsche has, right?
Yeah. And
you got these race cars that could probably do, I don't want to say like significantly more, because I feel like a new 911, it's very near, it's well into the range of diminishing returns, right? But that car can do things that the guy behind the wheel can't believe the car could do. So that's why I think the showroom 911 finishes the way it does.
I mean, they're truly unreal when they have a lot of traction, like a really good tire, like a really sticky one. It's truly unreal to use the launch control in those things out of the, right off the showroom, and you just like launch and you're just like, holy, like that was a street. Like this was an unprepped surface and it just did
from
like
a traffic light anywhere.
460 foot. Like what? It doesn't like comprehend that well that it's that impressive. Because of course for me, I'm a little younger, so I've experienced these cars. I didn't new cars to me weren't the same as like a new car to you. You talking about like a 200 horsepower car.
Right.
When I got into cars, it was 500 horsepower was pretty standard off the showroom floor for like a good Corvette or like a CTSV and stuff like that. So it's a little different. I'm a little more jaded to horsepower, I would say. And I can't imagine my son, who's going to be born in December.
How can he appreciate all of this?
Exactly. Like, I'm going to be like, oh, I used to race a 1,500 horsepower Camaro. And he's going to be like, okay.
Why? He's going to say why.
Like, why didn't it make any power?
Well, I mean, you had to put gas in it and like manually check tire pressures. Why go through the trouble when you could, you could get in this thing, some of these, the potential with electric vehicles, it's pretty amazing, right? And it's like amusement park ride-ish.
It's only limited by batteries right now. And the engines are already so good that as soon as the batteries can just output more to those engines,
right,
they're just going to be more incredible. And the tire technology is obviously going to be a huge part. And I know tires are a tough thing on those because they're so heavy.
Right.
That the compound is tough. So if a lighter battery could help, then you could change your tire compound. I think that would be a big part of it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as you're talking about that, I think about like how much simpler the vehicle management strategies are with the electric car versus something with an internal combustion engine with forced induction, right?
Yeah.
If you think about like your Camaro, you take that thing out and you had to go through all these steps had to happen for it to make power. And then it sees that it's spinning the tire. And then we want to stop it from spinning the tire. Well, we're going to try retarding timing, and we may close the throttle. And then maybe we might start to cut cylinders. And, it's so many steps to like recover, where the electric vehicle just says like, reduce the current to the drive engine, or the drive motor.
It knows
right?
like, oh, this tire doesn't have as good of traction, so it does tire by tire. My car has to see like a drive shaft and like what the engine's doing, what's the drive shaft doing, what's the front wheel doing, and like somehow an aftermarket ECU also has to be that intelligent. Like it's hard to compete with the intelligence of a stock ECU. They are so good now.
Absolutely. The processing capabilities of like the new stock ECUs is just, it's so fast. And, the data acquisition, just the engine speed control. Like you think about like what a two-step used to sound like versus what a car sounds like now. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Motec.
Yeah.
And one thing that just, makes me smile when I look at Brett's Mustang.
I knew that's where this was going, yep.
Is that car, like when it's pre-staged and goes into staging, it looks like a stock vehicle, right? It looks like the OEM set this thing up to drag race from the factory, right? I see cars like trying to bump into the beams, and I don't know how they don't red light every pass. They they go to creep the car forward and the car lunges and the suspension's bouncing and it's still bouncing when the, when the tree comes down.
Yeah.
Where
inconsistent once you let off that button, and that's kind of your problem is with the drag cars. You want it as smooth as possible, and I thought you were going to bring up his 3-step system too, where it gets up, it goes, and then it drops back down to boost.
Well, just everything.
It's so good to the ear.
Absolutely. I mean, and so that, and I guess it ties into like, I was thinking like you're talking about what the Porsches do, and then think about the fact that like when the GTR came out, if you launched that car, they'd void your warranty. And now you can buy the Porsche, you can launch that thing till the cows come home.
They want you to.
Nobody cares because that's a selling point for that car, right? And, they know that like you're going to launch that car, you're going to get bored launching the car before you're going to break it, right? And it's a major selling point. So, yeah, I mean, to be able to make cars do things is one thing, but to be able to make it do it in like a calm, sophisticated manner is what gets really impressive to me.
So we talked about Motec quite a few times. Was that the biggest pivotal point in the Huracan when the Motec kind of plug and play stuff started to come out? Because you got to use 2 of them, right? Yeah,
it has they use them in a master and a slave or a primary, secondary.
Oh, okay, interesting. I thought it was half the engine and half the engine each. And like one did the trans, I guess.
Well, the problem is that engine, it uses a ton of inputs and outputs, right? Because you got 2 injectors per cylinder, 4 camshaft position sensors, 4 camshaft control solenoids, so it would have been difficult to control all of it with one engine controller just because there's just, you can't run enough wires out of it.
Too many.
So the way it's set up is, you do some like setup and configuration in the secondary ECU, and it, shares information through CAN with the primary ECU, and most of the tuning is done in one ECU. So like you don't have to do a lot of bouncing back and forth from one ECU to the other. But the release of that Motec firmware package for the Huracan, it absolutely revolutionized what is capable with those cars.
Yeah.
It opened the door. I mean, it's a very proper tuning solution to a very complicated car.
That's what it seemed like from the outside. Like they started to progress really quickly as soon as that was, because from my understanding of not being in this world as much, it was one company had access to these plug and plays, and then it became open to kind of everyone that was building them. Like somebody had it first, I guess, for a while. I don't know if that was how it worked.
I'm sure. I mean, there's always somebody that they use to work, like test this out, give me some feedback. But Motec really does not do a lot of testing in the consumer market, right? I mean, Motec typically, they release a very finished, well sorted out package. Mm-hmm. With that said, I mean, they've probably had 200 firmware revisions, but that's largely based on requests from the end users, right? I mean, everybody's got their way they want to set something up or something different they want to set up, and Motec is very receptive to, if I send them an email and say, hey, here's what I'm working with, here's what I want to accomplish, would you consider adding this to the next firmware revision?
They'll write the software for you to be able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it generally like, you know what, that makes sense, no problem, here it is.
Mm-hmm. And if you're fighting with it, somebody else is probably going to benefit from it too. But then once you could go through all that work and make a whole new thing, and then everybody gets it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
So that's where, for you as somebody who's competing with other cars on the drag strip, you may not want everybody to get it.
Well...
If you do something fancy of launch control or some kind of nice rolling anti-lag for roll racing or something.
There are things that I have been reluctant to mention because if I request it, it's going to be in the firmware release notes, and then somebody's going to go, hey, wait, what is this?
Yeah.
And, the drag strip is one thing. And really, like, one of the big things that I feel it comes down to is, like, the components are available to everyone, right? Everybody can buy the Motec. Everybody can buy whatever turbos and wastegates and fuel injectors and fuel pumps. But that doesn't mean that all the cars are the same when they're done. The difference comes with the overall setup of the car and the configuration of the Motec, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you could take that Motec package and make one god-awful car to drive. If,
me and you can have all the same parts, and it's not going to turn out the same at all.
Right.
It's
Which, it's difficult to convey, like, what the overall ownership experience is of a car over the internet, right? Because, there's, think about the percentage of the time that you're actually going to be wide open throttling this car, right? It's a minuscule amount of time compared to the time that you spend getting to the place that you want to wide open throttle it, or do I want to drive this car today just to drive? And, it's not something, it's not something that everybody enjoys to drive in every case, right? So those are the things I wish, more people would be willing to discuss, because there's a lot more to these cars than what they do when they're wide open throttle.
Yeah, because those cars need a lot of drivability. My car,
Right.
I'm not super concerned about the drivability. If it bucks once or twice, I'm like, whatever. But if I have a Huracan and it doesn't have a cage in it and it's a factory appearing car, I want that thing to drive exactly how, the Germans intended it to drive. And once you put a different ECU in there, you basically start from zero, right?
Probably not zero. Motec gives you a good startup package.
Okay, that makes sense.
But, it takes some real understanding of, like, how every piece of hardware affects software, right? And how, you're not just tuning an engine in that car, right? The transmission does not operate independently of what the engine does. So, you've got to understand how, like, one thing affects another. So you could change a piece of hardware, which makes you have to change software. But then it's chase this, when really you should have just made the hardware right in the first place. Because when you tried to fix it with the software here, it created a problem over here.
Yeah.
And, you can start chasing your tail with that. And, to me, like, the most meaningful difference between a Gallardo and a Huracan is the dual clutch transmission. I mean, otherwise, the car is, like, cosmetically updated, great. But the transmission, like, is the upgrade. And to deteriorate the quality of that transmission and how it functions, it's completely unacceptable to me, right? I mean,
Yeah.
You can't ruin how this transmission behaves or the drivability of this car, because, I mean, if the one and only thing that mattered was make it go fast in a straight line, like, why would you do it with that car,
Yeah, of course. You can do it with a lot of other cars and go a lot quicker. And you're stuck with that transmission. It's not like with the Vipers where you can put whatever you want really in there. Like, that's what you get with that car.
Sure.
You're not deviating from that unless somebody does a lot of R&D and spends a lot of money on something crazy.
And it's not a bad transmission to be stuck with.
Of course.
Right? I mean,
it's not a Gallardo.
Right. It's not a curse. It's a gift.
Yeah.
So, but you have to keep the transmission happy, because, like, transmission behavior can ruin the experience of that car.
Yeah.
So, like I say, it's one of those things. It's like, it's hard to convey to the general public, right? And,
Well, every temperature change is so finicky on those, I would imagine. Engine temp versus trans temp, like, those kind of things have to be all, like, in a line and variable depending on what you're doing.
Yeah, and, when I say Motec gives you a good startup package, it is very much a startup package. And all of the modifiers that, that the car should be considering when you're operating it throughout a range of, temperatures, elevation, loads, you have to configure that. And one thing that these newer systems have gotten very good at is allowing you to tune like what really matters, right? So, earlier systems, they would have fuel enrichment by throttle position or rate of throttle travel, but very few of them considered like how big is the throttle body, right? What's the throttle area? And these newer Motec packages, they, instead of correcting, fueling by air charge temp, it considers what they call charge cooling. So it actually considers the cooling effect that the fuel has on the air charge, based on the amount of fuel that's going into the engine, right? So, and there's a modifier for ethanol, if you're going back and forth from petroleum-based fuel and ethanol, you change your charge cooling.
Yep.
Most people have never heard of fuel film, right? Or fuel film thickness, right? It considers that, if you're driving along and the primary injector is, fueling the engine, and then you go to open up the secondary injectors, we know that the wall of this intake runner is dry. And before the fuel even gets to the cylinder, it's going to have to wet the runner, right? So there's an effective delay there because the injector fired and it just wet the runner. It didn't even go in the cylinder.
Yeah, so there's like a slight stumble potential there.
Sure.
Where it's a little lean at that point.
Right.
So it has to compensate for just that wetting of the wall of the runner. Wow, that's very intense stuff. I'm sure no LS guy has ever thought of that.
And you can get the job done otherwise, but they did a really good job. I feel like Motec, they obviously have some, dealings with the manufacturer. I think the Huracan Evo, like track cars, have Motec engine management systems on. Mm-hmm. So the control strategy, it's a torque-based, everything is torque-based.
Yeah, all the new Corvettes, I think, are like that, too.
Yeah.
I've heard Jeremy Formato talk a lot about the torque-based systems.
Yeah, so they made their standalone package, the foundation of their standalone package is much like the foundation of the OEM ECU, which really makes it helpful when you're trying to make the rest of the car happy.
Yeah. So the Motec gives you this ability to do power by gear where the OEM doesn't work well with that, because I've seen OEM cars and once they hit their target boost is when things kind of get a little hairy on them. But then when I see a Motec car, it brings in the power so smoothly. I've seen a lot of that difference, or maybe that's just tuner related.
Yeah, it's almost infinitely configurable, right? Yeah. I feel like boost by gear is kind of like an archaic method of managing power, right? You can manage torque versus engine speed. You can manage torque versus vehicle speed. You can do it, versus gear if you want. And you can do all three integrated together. So, you can, much like what the factory cars do, right? You ever notice how back in the day, if you got 5 different brand new cars, somebody always had one that was a really good one. It was man, I don't know what it is with that car. It's a really good one. It's faster than all the rest.
Technically a lemon, but in the benefit of the,
right?
Of the consumer.
Right. Well, they didn't have all the torque limiting strategies on those cars, right? So now all these cars are just super consistent because everything is limited. And as long as all the cars are being used in a manner that they're able to reach the limit makes them all perform very equally.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. There's a ceiling there. Even if you have a factory freak,
sure,
there's still that ECU deal. One Huracan out there might have a little bit higher compression. It might be a little bit spicier, but you don't get to even know that.
You may have the car that makes 30 more horsepower than the rest, but it's never going to make it if that factory ECU has anything to do about it, right?
Yeah.
It's going to go, nope, I'm going to back the throttle off. I'm going to pull some timing. this is how much we make, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it does give, that's where like the benefit of aftermarket tuning could come in, on the stock cars. But I kind of feel like if you take one of those cars naturally aspirated and tune it for 20 horsepower, like it's hard to feel, right? It's not a real meaningful difference.
I've learned that as well. Like, 10 years ago, me would have been putting cold air intakes in stock cars and stupid things like that. But I don't, it's the low hanging fruit. Yeah, I get it. But it's not worth, it's just not, like, you're not going to really gain anything from it. It's not enough to be noticeable, especially if you have like a Silverado and you think you're going to put like a cold air intake and a ported intake and throttle body on that thing and pick up 20 horsepower and notice it in a truck, you're crazy.
Well, yeah, I mean, CAD design has revolutionized, all of this, right? I mean, I tell people all the time when they go, well, we're going to port the heads on this car, or we're going to, it's not a Fox body, right? It doesn't have like EGR bumps in the exhaust ports that you can grind out. I mean, the wall thickness of these cylinder heads, it's pretty thin, right? There's, if you're going to turbo it, the difference is going to be negligible. You could spend $10,000 in cylinder heads and maybe you get the same difference that another half pound of boost gave you.
Do you even put cams in those things?
No.
So just 2,000 horsepower factory cams.
Well, I mean, the purpose of changing the camshaft in something with a single camshaft is often that you want to change the overlap between the intake and the exhaust cam, right? Where with variable valve timing, you can change the overlap you can change the overlap on demand, right? Yeah,
but still, I mean, you would think you could add some more lobe to it to get like a little bit more open of a valve or something.
You could change lift and duration.
Yeah.
But I feel like
you guys don't.
What you come back to is these guys put a lot of work into this car.
Yeah.
And no component of this vehicle ended up on this car by accident, right? None of this stuff was laying around and they decided to throw it on the car because they had to.
Sometimes Volkswagen does that. Sometimes you're like, wait, is this from a Passat?
Right.
But it's like the little things. It's like
it's
like a blinker or something.
Right. But it's not like, what are we going to do for camshafts in the Huracan? Like, I've got these. Like,
yeah, this was in a TTRS.
Fine.
It's close enough.
No, I mean, those guys spent like at least millions of dollars developing every component. And especially when you're getting into like turbocharge applications, like whether the air wants to or not, it's going in the cylinder. Mm-hmm. There are some, one of the problems with like, okay, if you want to increase the lift of that camshaft, it doesn't have shaft-mounted rocker arms or stud-mounted rocker arms that you can adjust.
Yeah.
So, it's got a hydraulic lash adjuster, and the rocker arm sits right underneath the cam. So, you start to have to make like really big, complicated changes to get very little difference, right?
Yeah. So that's when you're really trying to do something crazy when, 90% of the effort gets you to the desired result of 99% of your customers.
Well, those are things you would try to do, like if you were racing some sort of spec class, right?
Yeah.
Here's what we allow. If global Huracan racing had a turbo size limitation, guys would start to consider camshafts, right? Mm-hmm. But if you look at like the Huracan, like the all-wheel drive 610 car versus the Performante that was a 640 horsepower car, they have different cylinder heads. They have titanium intake valves, titanium retainers.
Okay.
They kind of ported the heads like a plunge porting.
Mm-hmm. Just to like clean them up so they had less velocity.
It's really ugly,
yeah,
but it must do something.
Yeah, they don't do anything just because they want to.
They raised the compression, they changed the camshafts, They changed the exhaust. They've got different catalytic converters on it, and they tuned it. And they did all of this for 30 horsepower.
Yeah, that's crazy. Wow.
Right?
Oh my gosh, that's a lot of money in R&D for 30 horsepower.
Sure.
And different part numbers, and that's a big thing for a company to have to do.
That's massive changes. Again, like millions of dollars into development of those altered components. So like, what are the odds that like how many camshafts would I have to have made to improve upon what they did?
Yeah.
And, I found that, with the Ford GT years back, we had a GT that we were going to this Car and Driver magazine shootout, like to see like who could get from 0 to 200 and back to 0 the quickest. And we could, we had, freedom to do whatever we wanted on that car. And I tried 4 or 5 different sets of camshafts that were all spec'd out by John Mahovitz, which, I mean, he is the guy with modular engines, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
and that's a modular motor, which arguably is probably a lot easier to deal with than a Huracan engine.
Oh yeah, right.
It's not it's a camshaft. It's not
exactly. So I tried 4 different camshafts, 4 different sets of camshafts and adjustable cam gears, and I changed the lobe separation. I degreed the camshafts in like so many ways imaginable. And, maybe after like months of playing around with it, I had one configuration that gave us 20 more horsepower. It sounded like a pro mod when it idled. Mm-hmm. And I took it out and put stock cams back in because, the editors of this magazine were going to drive that car like 200 miles from their magazine headquarters to where they were going to test it. And I thought, they're going to hate this thing with these camshafts, and they're not going to care the least bit that it makes 20 more horsepower.
They're not even going to notice it.
Right.
2 people in the car.
Sure.
You're not going to notice that at all.
Right. So, some of these manufacturers, the manufacturers with these newer cars, the development process that the cars go through, they have like tremendous budgets, and it's very competitive, right? I mean, Ford will go buy the latest, greatest Corvette and bring it in, and they'll test it, and they'll take it apart, and, they'll listen, I want to go get the car that we're competing against.
Yeah.
Ford will, Ford Motor Company, when they were doing the new Ford GT, like they made sure to go out and get a McLaren 720 and mm-hmm. test it, and like, we need to make our car like better than this in some way.
I'm pretty sure the new C8, they had a bunch of Porsches that they were using.
Without a doubt.
They gave it to the engineers, and they were like, it needs to be better than this. And those engineers were like, Are you sure? Can we get something else? Can you just give us C7s?
Right. Yeah.
That's a tough pill to swallow when your supervisor hands you that.
Nobody wants to hear it, right? But you're looking at the supervisor like, okay, what's your idea? Understand how
much
good
money
this
do we
is,
have?
Right? The differences get so minuscule. How can we? And then we've got to do better than this, and we've got to come in at like half the price.
Yeah.
You don't have an unlimited budget to do better.
And they're made in Kentucky.
Right.
Like, oh, okay.
Well, consider that, Porsche is affiliated with Audi, Volkswagen, Bentley, Bugatti, probably somebody else, right?
They have the R&D team that we can't even imagine.
Absolutely.
And the equipment too, like I've seen some camshaft grinding machines. Have you ever seen those things? They're like World War II machines. Like they don't make them anymore. Like the people that want, like if you want to start a camshaft company and grind your own camshafts, like you have to find something that was used to help fight in World War II.
It looks like an antique sewing machine or something. You got to like foot pedal it to keep it going.
Yeah. And that's how a lot of these machines are. Like a lot of this stuff is like old school World War II-esque machine stuff. Now, Haas has kind of become a lot more mainstream. I know you got quite a few CNC machines, but a lot of that stuff like Bridgeports.
Well, there's certain types of machines that like like, okay, I've got a 5-axis CNC mill and, a CNC lathe, and I've got some manual equipment, and I've had instances where I've had problems with maybe gears and a transmission, and somebody goes, well, you got the machine, why don't you just make your own gears? Well, you don't make gears on a mill. They hob them or, cut them, right? So it seems to me like at some point in history that, the United States sold every machine that makes gears to someone in South Africa, because that's where they make gears. Like, very few people make gears in the United States, right? But it's a very specialized art form, right? I mean, how do you, how am I going to cut this gear? What kind of finish I got to semi-finish it before we heat treat it and then final finish it, and
tight tolerances on some old machine.
Right.
Somehow make that work. I mean, they're all World War II stuff. I don't think people realize that a lot of these things are old, like built submarines and stuff like that. Like, it's pretty crazy. I love the old machine stuff. It's cool to see those.
Yes. And it's not really super high-tech stuff. I mean, like, you have a cutter made, it rotates, it spins this blank around that it's going to cut the gear out. It's not a cylinder head where it's going in and it has to articulate and like machining the face of this gear, right? It's just, it's just a thing that goes along. It showers it with oil and blows the chips away, keeps it cool, and,
And you make those intakes, which, grinding away aluminum isn't exactly the most difficult thing to grind away, but if you put some hardened tool steel in there to make a gear, you're going to have a bad time.
It's definitely less fun to watch, right? Not only would you be doing it with the wrong machine, but like your tool life is significantly less. Like, I've made mistakes and had like an end mill travel through a piece of aluminum at 700 inches a minute, and I can hear it from across the shop, but it made it, right? I mean, I can hear that the load on that machine, it's like, wow, didn't break the cutter. Like, nice to know we can go that fast if we want to, right? But, I mean, if you try that in a piece of, like, chromoly, big block of chromoly or, like, stainless steel, like, it's going to make it like fractions of an inch before the cutter snaps and you're done.
So one thing I have heard is you have your hands in a lot of other people's stuff as well. Like, you help a lot of other shops that people probably don't realize. You make a lot of parts for just the Lamborghini market in general.
We do. Building these cars, like, these cars are very specialized.
Yeah.
And it would take anybody a really long time to have like a real thorough knowledge of these cars. So, at some point I saw like a lot of guys like diving into this market because they felt like, there's a lot of money to be made in the market, but they're not understanding the risk associated with building these cars. And one thing that's always true, one of my favorite sayings is, you don't know what you don't know. So, I identified one thing was that I have no desire to compete to build these jobs for the lowest cost, So, like, if you've got a potential customer that doesn't understand the difference between what the end result will be with me building the car versus someone else that may have never built one.
A race to the bottom isn't good for anyone.
Well, this guy will do it for less. Well, he's never done one. Right? He's promising you all these things, but he's got no basis for the promises. It's promises, right? There's no proof that, it could actually happen. And I understand the realities that are going to be associated with building this car. And this is the dollar figure that needs to like accompany this job. So I don't want to, I said, I'm not gonna start discounting what we do and start working for free. Like, I don't have an obligation to offer discount builds to like Lamborghini owners, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's always been my goal to offer the highest quality products, right? I mean, if you set what I do side by side with what somebody else does, like I can show you the difference. So I said, well, how about instead of these guys trying to redevelop things that I've already developed, I can brand these products and I can sell them these products. And one thing it does is it increases their chances of like successfully delivering on their promises. I can make some money off of cars that I didn't build. And you know, we don't like sour anyone's, we don't like run somebody away from like wanting to modify cars. You know, I mean that can happen. Like guys can have bad experiences with a tuning shop and decide like, I'm never modifying a car again.
The car world is pretty full of that, unfortunately.
And I hate to see that.
Promise the world and you get, you know, a box of parts back.
Sure. So, you know, the difference is if I promise you something, I'll deliver it. But how can you know that, right? Because that's what the last guy said. So, you know, like I hate to, you know, I don't want to, you know, compete to, you know, to be the cheapest. And we have products that are already developed. So, yeah, I do a lot of CNC machine products. We make intake manifolds, fuel system components that we provide to other shops for their builds. And we build a lot of transmissions I mean, we build transmissions for shops all around the country and some guys out of the country.
Yeah, the Middle East has a big market for this stuff, right?
I think the Middle East has got a big market for everything.
That is also. That makes sense.
But, you know, transmissions is another, like, you know, just to do that transmission, like, a lot of guys make the mistake of misunderstanding what the customer wants, and the customers make the mistake of misunderstanding what they want, right? So, well, what does this customer want? He wants a gear set in his transmission. Wrong. The customer wants his transmission to not break every time he drives his car, right? And ultimately, he doesn't really care what you do to make that happen.
Yeah.
But
he doesn't want to hear what you did. He probably doesn't care. He just wants it not to break.
I want to give you these dollars, and I want to be able to use my car, right? That's what the customer wants. So the shops will make the mistake of thinking like, well, that guy wants a gear set. I'll give him a gear set. Well, just making these parts be inside of that transmission case doesn't solve all the issues.
Yeah.
Right? So like that to me is like where the disconnect is, right? And the customer's disappointed, like, well, this shouldn't happen. I got a billet gear set. Well, you know, that's just the gear set. I mean, like there's so many other variables that come into play when you're trying to make that transmission actually function correctly and survive.
Yeah, I have a close friend, Kyle Loftus, who he had an R8 twin turbo dream car, and the car broke the transmission so many times on him, and he owns 1320 Video. The transmission broke so many times that he just got rid of the car. He was so sick of it. He just bought a
stock R8.
A new one, stock R8, because he was just sick of that problem.
And it's still stock. Yeah. So like exactly the thing that we were just talking about, it happened, right?
And he owns 1320 Video. He's been around these cars. Like, he's not just like some guy. He knows cars. No,
Kyle's a good guy. And, you know, it's unfortunate to see that happen. Like throughout the development cycle of some of these transmission components, I had arrived at a point where, like, I talked to a manufacturer and I, like, here's a list of problems that I identified. They're real problems. And you need to stop selling this product until you fix this, right? You need to sell 0 more of these because every one you sell is a problem, right? So, like, you're not making money if you're going to like install a known problematic product in somebody's car.
So you're talking to an actual OEM manufacturer on this, or like
not an
parts,
OEM,
okay, a parts manufacturer.
A parts manufacturer. And I said, listen, I mean, I've done enough of these. Like, this is miserable for me because I'm pulling transmissions in and out for free left and right.
Yeah.
You have to fix this. You can't continue to sell this. And I reached a point where, like, I flat out had to say, like, I won't sell any more of these products until this changes, right? It's just, I'm sorry, like, and I had customers come to me and say, hey, like, I want to buy this, I want you to do this, and like, I explained I would just tell people, like, I'm going to explain to you what I've been through, I'm going to explain to you what I see, and I don't want to, like, I strongly encourage you to hold off on buying these products. Like, I don't want to sell them to you. Like, you can get them somewhere, but you're not going to get them from me. Because, like...
And you won't put them in.
I won't put them in. Yeah. Like, it's going to be a problem, right? And...
It's going to make you not like the car.
It's going to ruin your experience with the car. And I just don't want to ruin... I want you to look back on this car, and I want it to be like a positive experience.
And that's a tough look broken down on the side of the road in your Huracan or in your R8. Like, it's not like me being broken down in my 4th gen. Like, you know, that's a tough deal to be putting that on a flatbed because of a known failure.
Well, to make matters worse, like, I feel like your average guy, you know, like, you know, an average guy that, like, understands that this car is making, like, an awful sound, and I should stop driving it, right?
It's true.
And they know that if they continue to drive it, it's going to cost more dollars to fix. Like a guy with a Mustang, like, he'll pull that thing right over, and he's like, look, I'm not causing any more damage. But typically, like, the R8 or the Huracan owner is like, I'm not getting stuck on the side of the road. Like, I'll drive this thing all the way home. I'll drive it to safety. And, like, in a lot of those instances, like, you know, we'd take stuff apart, and I say, you know, there'd be a lot less damage if you didn't drive like the other 50 miles once the noise started, you know,
that does
happening here, right? And the guy's like, yeah, but I just didn't want to be stuck on the side of the road. Like, totally understandable, right? But
you shouldn't have to be, really.
Right.
I get it. It's a modified car, but they've almost come to this level where they're OEM-esque modified cars. It almost gives that feel of like you bought like a Roush Performance Edition Mustang.
Right.
But it's like an OEM extension almost. And that's kind of how I see some of these twin turbo deals. Like, they're an OEM extension.
Well,
because you guys work so hard and so well to make them fit and finish, and like, especially when people do put their bumpers back on their Huracans. I do appreciate when a bumper's back on a car. The turbo kit's cool and all, but put the bumper on it.
Right.
They're OEM-esque is how I kind of see them.
Yeah. Well, I lost my train of thought there.
Yeah.
But,
well, we were just talking about failures and stuff like that. And one other thing Kyle had, too, was the tires. If he had the Michelins on his car and it was, like, all over the place, I think he dealt with. Like, when he was roll racing it because in TX2K, you roll race to 1,500 feet, too, so you're going pretty fast.
Yeah.
And, like, I guess the Michelins were unstable at high speed, I guess. Something weird like that.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I find that, like, road tires don't generally work the best on drag strips, and drag tires don't usually work the best on roads, right?
That does make sense.
So, I mean, on a sticky enough track, I mean, anything works pretty well. But
when you're at the 1,500 foot mark, you know, a lot less sticky.
Well, yeah, and I kind of feel like in some of the TX2K events, I understand the desire to lengthen the acceleration range because like the faster the cars go, the more impressive it is, and it's exciting for the people in the stands to see this huge number come up on the board.
225 and 231.
I mean, I think somebody went upper 230s. I think T1 in a GTR went upper 230s, maybe even 240 at the last one.
Yeah. Those are race cars, though. Those are real, like...
But they've got to stop that car.
Yeah.
So, you know, you've lengthened the acceleration zone, but by doing so, you've shortened the braking zone. And that's a little, it's a little sketchy because you don't have... I mean, ideally, you want time to be able to, like, smoothly transition from acceleration to braking, but, you got to get it done, in a limited amount of space.
Yeah, I mean, it's just physics, really, at that point. You have to have the runway to slow down an object in motion.
Right.
You can't get around that. It has to have the distance to slow down. And, that's why people end up in the wall, in the sand pit, and
Yeah.
all kinds of crazy things. They have dual parachutes on them because they're heavy cars comparatively to a lot of drag cars going that fast.
Well, like the tires are, especially drag tires, like radial tires, you can get away with a lot, but a soft sidewall drag tire, especially on all four corners of the car, like the tires are like a live component of the car, right? I mean, when you're accelerating with a drag tire, there's the tires wrinkle, right? There's energy stored in the tire.
Yeah.
The tire is
it's going
wrinkled.
one direction.
It's preloaded. It's going one direction, and you just like, the weight of the car is like transferred, toward the rear, and all of a sudden, like, you shift the weight. The tires snap like from being loaded to one direction, loaded to the other. The sidewalls give you a lot of like lateral movement.
Yep.
And it's just I personally I really dislike the way an all-wheel drive, like a car with 4 bias ply tires, like it's not a great experience.
No, it's definitely a little scary. That's why I think I see the R8s and the Huracan platform are still doing like a stiff sidewall, like R888R or something along those lines, a lot of them. But then like the GTRs are doing like a weird Mickey Thompson bias ply, and then like the front is like a Hoosier slick. Like they do like mismatched stuff to get the sizing right, and that's where it kind of looks a little scary to me.
Well, one of the things like that's really different about the GTR is like the distribution of the weight. It's got the engine in the front. Yep. I mean, it's a fairly like even weight distribution where the Huracan and the R8, it's got the engine, transaxle, it's all on the rear. It's like 60% rear, 40% front. And it's like 60 and 40 of 4,000 pounds. So
yeah, they're not light. And then you put the turbos back there. You put the intercooler stuff back there. You're adding weight to the back. Not like the front like a GTR does.
Right. But when Mickey Thompson tests tires, they do zero testing on a 4,000-pound car that traps 180 or 190 or 200 and a quarter mile. Yeah. Like, no testing goes into that. So, you're taking a tire that's designed to go on a 2,800-pound vehicle and, putting it on a 4,000-pound car that's got 60% of the weight in the back. And, the sidewall of that tire gets destroyed really quickly. And it's not a tire that's meant to have that kind of weight over top of it. So, I feel like I just mentioned that because it's important to understand that, like, well, yeah, that's a drag tire, right? Yeah, but this isn't really the drag car they had in mind. So,
you're punishing it in a unique way.
Right. So, just understand what you're working with here and, like, just consider it and, proceed cautiously.
Well, that's why you see those videos of the underground cars wheeling too. Like there's a picture of the red underground car like 4 feet nose in the air.
Right.
And like that's crazy to see a Huracan doing stuff like that. I know a couple, 2 years ago, Underground had one car spin out at the top end of Bradenton. They were testing or something.
Yeah.
I think it was probably a similar deal, tire situation where it was braking a little funky. The braking bias kind of got him a little bit, and then it just like, I don't think it touched a wall.
I think the car, was getting a little out of shape. They pulled the chutes to like try to straighten it out, but I think one of the chutes was torn. So the parachutes didn't work like exactly the way they should. And it was amazing to see Casey keep that car between the walls. Thankfully he did. But
it's pretty wide up there at Bradenton, thankfully.
Yeah.
And he's an experienced driver. I don't know them at all, the Underground guys, of just from what I've seen them drive a lot of cars.
I feel like not to take away anything from anybody, but I feel like in that instance, it would be hard to claim that you drove your way out of that.
Yeah.
And that luck had nothing to do with it, right?
Yep.
Right.
Yep. I've actually seen also RG hit a wall with a car. RG from 316, he tapped a wall with a car at Bradenton as well. And I think his deal was a factory ECU. When the power came in, it unsettled the car so bad that it just spun at like 400 or 500 feet out, and they couldn't bring the power in gradually enough,
right,
with the tuning that they had, and I think that was the cause of that one. Because like you could hear it like, and then like once it hit whatever fourth gear, it had a ton of boost into it, and then it just couldn't keep traction.
Well, yeah, I see a lot of cars like my car on my R8. Like I've tried to remain like really dedicated to not ruining what is to me a really nice car. Mm-hmm. I've ruined like plenty of my cars. That's
what we do as car guys.
Going on and on and on, and I used to drive this thing, and now I trailer it, and I just work on it all the time, and like I love my R8, right? It's like just to have that car, like it's an accomplishment, right? It's not something, it's not a toy. I don't take it for granted. I don't want to destroy it. So that car, like I've always run that car on a Toyo R888 RR, and I have been able to drive that car to Bradenton and back. The car's run a 784 at 185.
Yeah.
It's had a 131 60 foot on Toyos.
On what, a 19-inch tire?
That's an 18-inch tire.
18-inch, still, I mean, that's crazy.
So at that point, obviously, like, I hadn't been sevens before then. I didn't know that I ever really, that I really had to, but the car got close enough. I said, I might as well just like check that box.
Yeah.
So now the car is at the point where, to really step that car up, like a couple things have to happen, right? I've got to get rid of the Toyos. I love the way the car goes down the track. It goes like arrow straight down the track. It's a zero drama experience. Like you could put anybody in that car and they could make 7-second passes in that car, but I see a lot of the cars now, like, in order to go quicker, they're on to like an ET Street R, which it's a radial, but it's a drag radial. And now I start to see the cars, like they don't go so straight down the track.
I'm thinking of Amy Pello's car, Tony's wife. I've seen some videos of that car, and it's like she's driving that thing like it's a no prep car. Like she's like chopping at the wheel and stuff, and great driver, but like the second you get on a track where you're out of the groove a little bit, it could be scary. But
absolutely.
Like, you want to just, like my Camaro just goes right down. Like I'm not doing anything crazy in there. I'm not chopping at the wheel. But man, I can see how that can be a little hairy.
Without a doubt. I mean, and like there's been, I think anybody that's seen Amy go down the track is willing to admit like she has more balls than I do, or, most any of the guys. Like, the older I get, or the farther I get down the road of life, like the less risk I'm willing to take, right? So
your all-wheel drive car power wheeling in third gear?
Sure.
Like that's what I think that car did. That it was power wheeling in second and third gear when it hits it, which is just wild to see. And your all-wheel drive car now, your front wheels that are still spinning and trying to hook up are going to land and try to hook up again. Like my car, it may wheelie a little bit, but like it's not going to try to like drive with those front tires when they land.
Well, the problem as I see it is the front differential in that Huracan looks like it came from an easy-go golf cart.
A little tiny guy.
I mean, it is tiny. I mean, it's got to be like a 6 or 7 inch ring gear, right? So, and the axles are, honest to God, smaller than the front sway bar. Right? So one of my concerns is like, if you've got that thing wheeling, and I can't even explain how they do it, but sometimes they'll pick up a bunch of front wheel speed. Like the front wheel speed will run away from the rear wheel speed. So if that thing picks up a bunch of front wheel speed and sets down on the ground and blows that differential apart, it's going to lock the front wheels up on the car. Mm-hmm. And if the front wheels are locked, like you're out of control. So anybody else is welcome to do whatever they want to do. Like, it looks cool. I'm happy to see it work out for them, but I wouldn't do that, right? I mean, to me, like, I see, like, GTRs. Like, GTRs, those are... I don't know if I've ever really seen, like, a really fast GTR go straight down the track. I mean... Yeah. They have got to travel, like, at least 1,400 feet in a quarter mile. like slaloming back and forth. And like, I would never be steering a car from one side of the lane to the other to get to the end. Like, I would shut that thing down. I would call the chassis guy and say, hey, let's work this out.
The GTRs always felt to me that they're trying to rip themselves apart. Like,
Yeah.
the front wheels are trying to, like, rip themselves from the back wheels. The back wheels are trying to, like, push through the front of the car. And, like, they just seem like they're just unhappy and, like, fighting each other almost.
Yeah.
It's never seemed like a nice...
I mean, like, there's everything about it is violent, right? I mean, it's a 6-cylinder engine making, like, ridiculous power. Like, the power per cylinder that thing is making is just insane.
It's one of the most impressive engines, I feel, for
Sure.
power for cylinder, displacement, and everything, and the number that they make. They're making like 4,000 horsepower on those things. Like, it's absolutely bonkers that they do that. And, the V10, of course it does that kind of thing. But, like,
Sure.
it's just a different...
It's not making the power per cylinder. The thing would be making, 4,000 horsepower if it was. Mm-hmm. But, when I bought my R8, I bought that car because they announced that at DCT Cup or GTR World Cup was going to have a DCT class.
Yep.
And, I went over to GTR World Cup the year before, and...
Down in Palm Beach.
No, it was over at Bradenton.
When they moved it to Bradenton, yep.
But I saw, like what stood out to me was, like, I saw all these guys having fun, right? And if one guy broke, somebody else would help him out. One guy blew up a trans and 3 other people, brought parts over. And I thought, man, like, I haven't seen camaraderie, like, there was no camaraderie in, like, the Huracan market, for, quite a few years. And I thought, it almost made me want to go buy a GTR because I want to be part of this race. So when they announced this DCT class, that day, like, my wife and I were walking the dog, and I said, I think we should buy an R8 and build it. And that was like December. The race was in January. So, like, I got it, I called the guys at Chicago Motor Cars and, hey, I like this black R8 you have. And he's like, great, I'll get it on a truck.
Ship it in. Yeah.
I'll get it on a truck today. We built the car.
I bought my CTSV from them.
I mean,
from Eric.
Such a good experience to work with those guys.
Yeah, they got... I always tell people, if you've never been on their website, it's just like, go scroll through supercar after supercar, hypercars, Sennas and stuff. But yeah, cool deal.
They're just so enjoyable to work with.
Yep. And then they put on DCT World Cup. It's the same guys that sell those cars.
Yeah.
Eric and them, and Arnie helps with that stuff. And yeah, I digress from that.
Yeah.
But DCT World Cup, it is actually coming up again.
Yes.
And it used to be GTR World Cup, now it's DCT World Cup.
Yeah, I would love to see, like, more. I obviously, like, it makes sense to me to put effort into the expansion of dual clutch racing because it's what everybody makes now, right?
And it's good for you guys because you really can't compete. I say you guys as in dual clutch because you really can't compete on a 400, like a pro tree. You really need a sportsman tree to be able to,
unfortunately,
have a race. Yeah. They race at World Cup, but they always are slow on the tree, but they have a lot of power, so they can kind of get by with that. But, like, unfortunately, that's the crutch of it.
It is. I mean, and, like, for that reason as well as numerous other reasons, they're terrible race cars, right? If you want a race car, like, get a race car, right? I mean, not something that takes, like, a day to get the transmission out of and back in, right? Just, back when we used to drag race Vipers, I could put a transmission in that in 45 minutes. Like, I could put spark plugs in the thing quickly, right? I could repair it at the track, but, like, if one of these cars breaks something at the track, you're more or less done for the weekend. Which
I think I saw the GTR guys just had, like, a whole subframe that they would just put in, like, engine, trans, and all. They would just, like, or, like, the whole rear end and then the whole front end. They'd have, like, spares of both, and they'd just, like, slap them in.
The cost of that is,
of course,
it's staggering, right? And so, after I bought my R8, I ran that event, and what people saw, like, every day I drove my car to and from the track. The car ran 8s on 20-inch radials, and I never touched the car between rounds aside from pulling data. And I won that event. And after that event, like,
did you get a Rolex?
I got, no. The Rolex, I think, is like a drawing thing, you know.
All right.
But after that event, like, I mean, for weeks, I got calls from GTR owners that said, listen, I watched you the whole weekend. And because I thought, you know, I had one guy tell me that he thought I had to be hiding something. So he's like, he strategically parked where he could watch me because he wanted to see like when I was working on the car and like when I was like fixing broken things. He goes, I watched you the whole weekend. You know, you just get out, take your suit off, drink a water, pull the data, go race. And he says, man, I want that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all these guys said, look, I've been racing this GTR and I'm over it. You know, it lives in the shop. It's always broken. Like, I'm just kind of over it. And so what I'm trying really hard to make sure I don't do is turn the R8 back into the GTR. You know, like, let's take a more expensive car that you thought you'd enjoy and get you right back where you were with a broken shop car all the time, right?
I think that's a standard progression of a lot of GTR owners is they end up in the V10 platform of some form.
Yeah.
They because, you know, the GTR was a lot before and the R&D already happened. So, like, you already kind of race a similar-ish car, and now you just kind of, like, almost graduate to, like, the better platform, I want to say. I mean, they're not, it's, you know, GTRs are good, but they're definitely not Huracan good.
I find that, like, you know, it's pretty unlikely that GTR guys are going to decide to go buy Mustangs.
Yeah.
Right? You know, I don't really know what GTR guys were before they were GTR guys, but they usually weren't Mustang guys.
I think they were DSM guys.
Okay, right?
I think some of them were, like, Eagle Talon guys.
Right. So, you know, if you're going to get out of a GTR, like, what else is the car?
Yeah.
You know,
what's next at that price point? Same shops, same people, kind of like same world. You're not making like a big jump anywhere.
And a lot of the shops were like faced with dealing with like, well, I'm a GTR shop, but my customers are like disappearing. So they have to work on these V10 cars. And, you know, it works because this was already a customer. You had a relationship. You like to work together. So it makes sense. You know, I guess to backtrack a bit, you know, I'd lost my train of thought earlier.
No, you're good.
You know, one of the things I was thinking is like, I noticed like a lot of people, they commonly make the mistake of they use the word upgrade a lot, right? I'm going to do some upgrades. Like, I've got an upgraded this and an upgraded that. And there's a misconception that just because something was purchased in the aftermarket, that it's an upgrade. But, you know, in these newer cars that you're dealing with, like, who in the aftermarket has the quality control and the engineering that OEMs do, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that there aren't some upgrades. There are upgrades, but it's not easy to upgrade these cars, right? I mean, because they come with good components on them.
Yeah.
So I feel like and what goes hand in hand with the guys that say, I got an upgrade this, and, you know, there are guys that will make things and sell things that they're not really upgrades. And you'd say, well, why do you sell that? Well, because people buy it.
Yeah.
Right? And I have a hard time with that, right? I mean, you know, like I have like a set of principles that I like to stick to that, like, you know, I always think about like, well, if I was going somewhere and trusting them to like take my money and decide how to distribute it throughout this car, you know, what do we want to dedicate this funding to, and like what's a waste? So, you know, like I put a lot of thought into, you know, what we're building for the cars, like what we do. It has to serve a purpose. And it, you know, it needs to be an upgrade, right? It needs to solve a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of these people could easily get, you know, kind of not taken advantage of, but like sold snake oil, duped in a way by a shop thinking you need all this crazy stuff when you really don't. And like most of these guys, they own some business. They don't care, like they don't need to know what fuel system or injectors are in the car. That's not what they need to think about all the time. So like it's up to the shop owner like you to consult these people into the right direction.
Right.
And that's where the principles come in.
Exactly.
No snake oil.
And that's what, like when somebody, one of my least favorite terms is like the stages, right? Like I want to.
Unless you're a Subaru owner.
I want to stage this or stage that, and like it's not a unit of measure that's like predetermined. It's not like a gallon or an inch, right? So I generally will say like, okay, we'll slow it down. Like, what do you want the car to do? Like, kind of paint the picture for me. Like, what do you envision this car like doing? Like, you're going to use this car. Like, where are you going? What are you doing with it? What are your expectations? And like, quite often the expectations were like formed off of like stuff that was read on Facebook. And most people failed to consider that like nobody tells you like the horror stories about their car, right? I mean, they just, because they're sad and they don't want to talk about it, just.
Yeah. Some shops are pretty good about keeping that stuff under wraps too. Like stuff breaks and some shops kind of like,
right.
Just bring it back. We'll go pick it up.
Sure. I mean, and,
they have reputations.
Cars break. I mean, and like if somebody comes to me and says like, well, listen, I just don't want to ever have a problem. Okay, well, if you keep that car exactly the way it is, that car will fail to meet that expectation.
You could buy a stock McLaren and it's going to fail.
Definitely a McLaren.
It will fail.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Your McLaren will fail. Like, I guarantee that.
Bone
right?
stock, untouched.
But this is why that dealership has a parts department with spare parts and a service department with technicians to install the parts because they break. And, making your car more powerful doesn't always make it more reliable. It rarely does, right? So, there needs to be some education on how to use the car, like a realistic expectation.
Well, serviceability becomes a big thing now at that point. Like you have to change the oil a little more now. You're heating them up with turbos and stuff. Like you got to take a little bit better care of it. You can't just go put 5,000 miles of beating on it.
Right.
And expect all your fluids to be as they were.
I've had that conversation.
I bet. I can't
Well, it says 5,000 miles. Yeah, that's 5,000 miles back and forth to work, right? It's not 5,000 miles of like wide open throttle highway pulls, right?
How long were you out at TX2K doing highway pulls?
And, like I generally will tell people like, I change the oil in my car like after every like major, event, right? I mean, if I spend a weekend at the drag strip, it gets an oil change.
I cut my filter open every time.
Yeah.
I inspect it. Like you got to keep an eye on that stuff.
Right.
It's easy to find it's easy to catch a problem when it's like that.
Not everybody understands that. They, like I'll hear guys say, well, like it shouldn't have a problem. It's a built motor. I'm like, well, I mean, in theory, like nothing should ever have a problem. And theoretically, everything's perfect.
Yeah.
Like the term, like, built motor, it's another generalization. It's not a motor anyhow, it's an engine. But, like it's built. Like, what's that mean? Like what parts came out, what parts went in, like what was changed, what are the tolerances, it's just, you got to help people understand what they're getting into. And I find that like if somebody has a car and they are under the impression that this car is indestructible, they will operate it in a manner that you wish they didn't operate it in, right?
It's true.
So
that's a scary thought.
Right? They will do things with that car as long as they believe that it's indestructible. I mean, like they'll just, do like unbelievable things to the car. But when you help the person understand that like, just because we've upgraded these components, it's not indestructible, right? I mean, you can break it. And I will like map out for people, like if you want to break the car, do exactly this. If you don't want to break the car, avoid exactly this, right? And, I've had at least one customer that goes, I went out and pretty much did exactly what you told me last week would break the car, and I broke the car, right? I said, okay, great. Like, I mean, this is a guy that I really enjoy working with. He's like super honest about what he does with the car. Like,
Yeah.
like, man, you want the car to do this? I'll make it do it. It's going to be right. It'll only live this long. It's not a warranty thing. And, you know, if you can help me understand like what led to this failure, like I can identify the problem more quickly. It costs you less money. You know, like I really enjoy seeing guys enjoy their cars, right? I mean, there's a lot of, a lot of thought and time and effort that goes into building these cars. So, you know, to put one together and, you know, have it like just sit in a garage under a cover, it's, you know, it's not exactly gratifying. You know, it's more fun to, you know, I like to hear back from people that, you know, man, I just took my car out like this, you know, can't believe what this thing does, and, you know, having a good time with it.
Taking people for ride-alongs and stuff, because if you've never, getting ride-alongs in those kind of cars, if you're not used to it, if you drive some pickup truck every day and like you've never experienced like a twin turbo car just doing a pull, because, you know, even my Camaro, like when you launch it, that's when it's fun. In a twin turbo R8, or even roll into it from 60, it's a riot. Like,
right.
That's serious. Like my car, I tell everybody, the 60-foot, 330-foot, that's where all the excitement is.
Right, right.
But not in those cars. It's really just so different.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty engaging car. I mean, it makes cool noises. Like, it just doesn't, it does things that like make me question how much better can a car possibly get? You know, like where are we going to go with cars from here?
Yeah.
Like, you know, if they were to come out with like the predecessor, you know, or the replacement, you know, whatever the replacement for the Huracan or the R8 is, like, well, what could I hope for a car to do that would make it definitively better than this car?
Yeah, like if you were to go to Audi and give them a list of things you want, like it's hard to even think of that.
Right.
You know, from the Gallardo to this was easy. But from this to the next thing, it's like, I mean, I guess lighter. And they've already done that with the STO and the Evo.
Yeah.
And then people do all-wheel drive swaps on those and make them just lightweight and crazy.
Yeah. I mean, the engine is phenomenal. I mean, it's actually torquey, you know, for what it is. It revs high. Stock engines, like responsibly tuned, will tolerate, you know, north of 1,500 wheel horsepower.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, imagine that. Like you're taking an exotic car off the showroom floor and you're taking a car that made 500 wheel horsepower and you're adding 1,000 wheel horsepower, you know, worth of boost on this thing, and it lives.
Yeah, we don't have this conversation in any other car, like any other hypercar. Like Ferrari doesn't get involved in this conversation. McLaren doesn't get involved in this conversation. The 720, they take power pretty well. It seems like up to like 800. They're pretty good. And after that, it seems like everything kind of domino effect after that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the McLaren, like and
the 570 is pretty good.
It's a smaller displacement V8 that already has turbos.
Yeah.
Right. So we've got a big V10 that has no turbos. You add turbos, and guys talk about, well, what about lag? Well, we're not dropping your compression from 12.5 to 1 to 8.5 to 1. Like, it only gets better, right? Nothing about it gets worse. It doesn't get less responsive or less torquey. It's like as good as this, and then better. You know, once you start forcing air through that engine.
It seems like the only thing they can do is just shed weight. Seems like the only real make it better. It'll be a more nimble, it'll be a more easy to drive car at that point if you just make it lighter. I think that's the only real answer. But hard to make it lighter without making components weaker.
It is, and like it's, you know, crash regulations are a big part of that as well. Like, you know, if you look at that car, I mean, that car, like the center of that car is like carbon fiber. And then it has frame rail extensions in the front and rear that are aluminum, and they use, you know, whatever, some kind of, you know, crazy glue to like bond them all together, which, you know, when you talk about wheeling those cars, right, makes that extra scary because like if you wheelie one of these things, you better ride it out and get it down softly, because if you get scared and lift and the front end of that thing slams down, your car may be totaled.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you bend the front frame rails or damage the carbon tub, like, you just can't put it on a frame machine and bend it back.
Yeah, it's done at that point. It's totaled out.
It's a totaled car.
Yeah. And you can't just easily put cages into them either because of that.
Right.
It's not as, like, you have to do bolt-in style stuff. Like, NHRA has regulations on, like, how to bolt in a cage. It's similar like Corvettes. They have to bolt to fiberglass and steel frame rails and stuff, and aluminum on the Z06s.
Yeah, I really feel like, like, safety is a big deal to me. I mean, if I'm going to be driving a car or, like, building a car for a guy that's going to pilot it down a drag strip, like, I want my customers to be safe, which is really what made me start to, like, pull away from Vipers when we started doing the all-wheel drive car. Like, second-gen Vipers, they ran mostly on AEM, engine management systems. Traction control wasn't great on those cars. Like a Gen 2 Viper, they didn't have anti-lock brakes, so they didn't even have individual wheel speed sensors. And, maybe like 2006, like the power levels that people were wanting in Vipers, it just kept increasing. And like we'd been a 799 in a second gen Viper by 2005.
What transmission was in that?
That had a Turbo 400 or a
Turbo 400.
TH210 from Rossler.
Okay, that's what I figured. I was gonna say there ain't no way that was a T56.
No.
Yeah.
No, we went like 850s with the T56, which was, that was pretty cool.
Very respectable for even currently.
Yeah, when I watched a video of my buddy Gary driving that car to 850s, all I can wonder is, why did you finish this pass? It was so, like, you watch the video and it becomes like blatantly obvious, like, how inefficient this manual transmission is. And it's like the time for the gear changes and the steering the car back and forth, correcting the thing, like the driver input, it was, compared to like, my R8 running sevens, like it's nothing, right? It's just, right? I asked him, like, man, why would you finish this pass? Like, it seems almost obvious, like you're going to crash the car. Like, somehow you didn't, but that's just what it used to be like if you wanted to pilot a car like that down the track.
And in the Vipers, you sit so far back that by the time they're out of shape, it's almost like, by the time you feel that it's out of shape,
it's
almost too late because you're sitting over the rear axle almost.
Right.
And it gives a weird perception.
It really is.
And that's what was always kind of the thing about the Vipers, is why they spin out a lot, is because of that perception of like where you are in the car.
Sure. Like a really good example of that, like a Saleen S7 has you sit almost on top of the front wheels. Mm-hmm. And it's a super awkward feeling, like running that car through corners, because you don't feel like you're in the center of rotation. You're moving left to right with the front wheels. It's where, like you say, in a Viper, like you're almost in the back, and you feel like yourself like kind of getting slung around with the back wheels as it's wiggling. And
so the Saleen S7, I had to talk about that on here.
Okay.
We've gone for a while, and I would love to have you back, if anything. But, the Saleen S7 stuff is cool because you're one of the few people that have probably put their hands on, like, really on those cars, no?
Yeah, I would think so.
It's not like you don't see those things at all. I've been to Cars and Coffee all over Florida, and I've never seen a Saleen S7 show up. And that seems like where they would show up to.
Yeah, there's at least 2 in town here that I know of.
Okay.
And they don't get driven much. And man.
So what are they? Like, what is the real, what's the, like, where did they come from? What is the start of it? Like, what is the history of a Saleen S7?
Okay, as far as I know, right? Steve Saleen, they were doing the Saleen Mustangs for the Ford dealers, and he wanted to build, a road race car to compete in, like an SCCA racing series, mm-hmm. right? So they built the Saleen S7, but in order for that car to be eligible to compete in the class they wanted to compete in, you were required to build a certain number of road-going cars.
Yeah.
So the S7 really started out as a race car. I mean, it's a chromoly tube chassis race car.
Oh, wow.
I
didn't realize that.
A carbon fiber body on it, and was later like retrofitted with the street equipment to be able to sell the car to people to drive on public roads. Mm-hmm. So it is, I'm trying to think of the word for the car. Like it's,
it seems like it's just like a science experiment.
well, I hate to say things that like might like ruin somebody's like, perception of a dream car. But it's one of those, like it falls into the category of cars that like people think it's amazing because they haven't experienced it. And I think it's probably like a really killer car around a road course, but it's a race car for the street, and like the radiators are laid down flat. So like if the car's not really moving, you really don't have any airflow. So like it would run hot sitting in traffic, and the air condition doesn't want to work, and the seats don't slide back and forth. And
it all sounds like it connects to that OEM has all this money and time to develop cars, whereas somebody...
For sure.
If you develop a car, of course you don't have what OEM has. And that's kind of how it seems like he developed this car. It's just like a guy that wanted this car, and he did the best that he could.
Sure.
In the parameters that he had.
And it's a race car. Like it's a race car. Like it's a very unique car. Like it's a very unique driving experience. And like, we built one for a guy a couple of years back, and I took it to a car show at Lakewood Ranch, and like, like that was like one of like, I don't know how many situations where like, I'm driving down the street and I'm contemplating like, how did I get here? Right?
Yeah.
How is it possible that this is a thing that like some guy brought me a Saleen S7 and said, hey, make this thing really cool. And it's on a Motec M150, and it's flex fuel, and it's drive-by-wire, and traction control, and launch control. And
what engines were in those?
It's a 351 Windsor that comes with it's an aluminum block.
Yeah. And
it has aluminum Yates cylinder heads.
So those RPM well.
They might, but those ones, like, that engine might, but the S7s don't. Like, it has a Hogan's sheet metal intake that has, like, it's got intake runners that are probably 12 inches long. Like, the intake manifold was really geared towards making torque. So it's got really long intake runners. They're pretty done by 6,000 RPM.
Yeah.
But it's a dry sump engine. The heads are great. It's got shaft mounted rocker arms on it.
So you're driving this thing and you're just sitting there thinking, what led me here? You're probably feeling like a little bit of, like, they call it imposter syndrome, when you're like, why kind of me in a way? Like,
well, yeah. I mean, like, it was, really like when I like started like thinking of it all, like it was almost like a euphoric experience, right? It was a nice day. The S7 is nicer to drive when you're rolling because it's got this carbon clutch. It's super grabby, and if you get stuck in traffic, like, it chatters and all the body panels, rattle and whatnot. So like once you're driving, like it's much better. So like, I'm driving along, and like I'm just like I'm playing with this thing, like listening to like the sound of the engine and the turbos, and yeah, I'm just thinking like, well, I mean, how is it possible that I could have, gone from, like being the guy that the neighborhood police department was always coming to see for doing burnouts or making a bunch of noise in my Mustang, and somehow or another, like I'm like blessed with this opportunity to like take this car and make it function the way I feel like it should function, right?
So you took basically like he had the blueprints and the design and the layout, and then you were kind of there to make it all work happily for this customer, like with the Motec and stuff, and like make it perform like an actual street car more than like a car that the guy had to make because he had to make it because he was making race cars, so he had to make that street car in a way.
Well, so they came out with the first S7. They were all naturally aspirated. And they had like an EQ5 Mustang engine controller that in no instance whatsoever at that time there was no EQ5 car that ran with turbos, like nothing had boost. So, the S7, the first S7s were naturally aspirated cars. And then after the first year, they decided we're going to make some turbo cars. And when they made the turbo cars, they put turbos on the car. And they didn't put intercoolers on the car. And they didn't put bigger injectors in the car. And they didn't lower the compression. And I almost feel like they counted on the fact that nobody's really going to drive this car anyhow, right?
Yeah.
And if somebody did, it was a problem.
What does it have for like user interface when you're in there? Like, because, your IATs are going to be insane driving this thing at any amount of time, I would imagine, with no intercoolers.
Right.
Can you see anything? Is there any warnings? Like, what kind of screens? Do you have like a gauge of some sort? Like,
it's got an analog gauge cluster,
probably out of another car.
No, it was like a custom-made gauge cluster. With no information pertaining to like a force induction car.
Yeah.
So we like I say we made an intercooler system for the car. The Motec was a big deal. Like the factory turbo cars don't have a manifold pressure sensor, so it doesn't even know how much boost you're making. And this one that we did, somebody had installed a boost controller, even though there was no boost gauge and there was no manifold pressure sensor. And the second time the guy drove it, it put holes in 6 pistons. And so the guy that owns this car, he is a super fun guy to work with. And, he just kind of gets to the point. And I said, well, like, what do you want from this car? Like, what do you want the car to be? And he goes, what I'd really like is to be able to drive this car like out of my driveway, drive around, and then drive all the way back home under its own power. Is like that would make me really happy.
What a big
right?
ask.
That's what I want out of this, out of this supercar. And I'm like,
what a dream.
Okay, I got it. And so like the implementation of the traction control and whatnot, and I mean, of course, like it gets costly. Like the time to do the wiring harnesses.
It's all custom.
He goes, man, it's getting a little expensive. I said, you want to know what's expensive? Crashing this car, right? Because, even when it was set up, like the car, like it's limited to 30% throttle in second gear. And like under no circumstance can that car put 1,000 to the wheels down. Like it, so I said, there are no parts for this car. Like, we need to preserve this car. Like, you can't get squirrely and run it over a curb because, like, you won't buy a wheel, you won't buy a fender, a front end, So, think about it like that. Think about the money that it's going to save you versus what it's going to cost you.
Yeah, and once you do it now, that's probably one of the best examples.
Sure.
Of a Saleen anywhere. It can roll across Barrett-Jackson or something, and it's like the best one that's going to be sold anywhere because it has that extra time. That may not mean a lot to everyone, but there's definitely a lot of people out there that dream of that perfect S7.
If you want to drive the car, like this is for sure, I think, the most drivable one. Like it's, it has safety features that's going to like protect the engine and alert you if there's a problem. And
what a wild concept.
Right. Yeah. So, I feel like when your average person goes to a dealership, like I don't care what car you're buying. Nobody has a tremendous appreciation for the fact that this door opens and closes properly. And if it rains, the water stays outside the car. Like, it's a thing that people don't appreciate. But when you encounter, if you ever try to build a kit car or encounter these like low volume production vehicles,
Yeah.
you know, you see like, man, it's not that easy to make a door open and close nicely and keep water out.
Sounds like another dig at McLaren.
I'm not naming names, but
I mean, they're like MP12-C1425. That early one was a bad car.
come on, how many times do I have to swipe the bottom of this door before the door opens? Come on, you know.
Even the name was hard.
Right.
But I know that was always the early complaint of low production cars, and it takes time. I know. I mean, if you look at like the Tesla Roadster, similar deal where it's like the early production, slow volume cars are always going to be tough, and there's very limited people that can work on them. This is a whole nother thing, but like the new Ford GT.
Yeah.
Very low numbers, low amount of people that work on them. Ford doesn't even want to deal with them anymore. They're pretty much like, don't bring them to us.
It's a nuisance for them, right?
Don't talk about that anymore, please.
The risk versus reward for a Ford dealer to take this car in, like, surely makes them say, like, you know what, we'd rather like fly the guy in and send him to your house, right? Because like, how many new Ford GTs can your average mechanic be working on a weekly basis?
They should not work on any of them for the most part. Your average mechanic probably shouldn't touch any Ford GT.
Like you say, it's one of those cars, like, if you drag your work boot over the carbon fiber door sill, it is the carbon fiber tub, which is not replaceable, not easily, right? So, I mean, people just, like you have to treat cars like that with so much care. You know, if you get in and go, oh man, sorry about that. You know, I scuffed your carbon fiber tub.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big deal, right? You can't fix it. And that's a thing that, like, for the dealer, like, how do you make that right? You know, it's just one of those things, like, it's probably better that the car doesn't come here. Like, then nobody can like run into it, or, you know, it's almost a terrifying experience to like be in possession of something like that and responsible for it.
I think I heard this with the P1, that there's just like one group of guys that service the P1, and they're just like, you know, if your P1 needs to be serviced anywhere in the country, they just have their van with all the stuff, and they're the only guys because they don't want the P1s going to like most McLaren dealers and stuff like that. It's one of those cars. It's one of like the low production. It's not the F1.
Not the F1.
No, because those are even...
That one's even more exclusive.
Yeah, that's like, it takes a year to service it or something crazy.
Right.
Like, I know Jay Leno serviced his.
Yeah, as I hear it, like the McLaren F1 service software operates on MS-DOS, and no modern laptop can even like run this software, right? Because DOS is gone.
Yeah.
So, one of the concerns was that, like, if these laptops die, like, we don't know how we're going to service these cars.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can see that. I mean, like, Perrin at Chicago Motor Cars, we were in Las Vegas, a little while back, and he'd text me and he goes, oh God, I bought a P1 and I sent it over to the dealer, like, hey, check it over. I'm going to sell it. And they're like, well, it's due for some service. And they get the bill and it's $200,000, right? And nothing was broken.
It just needed the fluids.
Just maintenance. It needed a battery, the big lithium, the lithium battery. That's a big deal, right? Yeah. But yeah,
I got a friend going through that right now with his battery, the flooded car, Tavares.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've been wondering, like, what happened with that car.
He bought it and he's rebuilding it. This YouTuber, I think you've dealt with him a little bit in the past with when he had his twin turbo car. Way back, he tried to get people to tune it. He built like a twin turbo car in his garage, and it was on Styvek, but nobody wanted to tune it, understandably.
Right.
Because he built it himself, and like, I just heard that he tried calling around every local tuning.
Maybe. And I personally, like, I try to avoid that because,
As you should.
I mean, whatever happens, the last guy to touch it gets the blame for everything.
Exactly.
You know, oh, it blew up. Probably tuner's fault.
And
You know,
I don't
just-
think he held anything against anybody for turning him away. I think he understood
Right.
the risk that any shop with a name takes putting, you
Sure.
know, getting involved in something like that where it's like, I built the turbo kit and I don't know the engine specs and like,
Well, and how much money can you charge for a tune versus like what's the liability associated with this, right?
yeah.
Has someone else already tried to tune it? Have they damaged it already? Well, you know, some of the times it's like, well, I had it to this other guy and he couldn't get it right. Well, I mean, does it have a broken ring already? Like, is this thing on its last leg? Like, you know, I've got no motivation to touch something like that. It's just, you know,
Yeah, it's just all risk for you because best case scenario, it runs okay. Worst
Right.
case scenario, it blows up. So it's like, it's just all risk almost. Because even, you know, it's not going to light the world on fire. It's just a twin turbo home built Gallardo. So it's like, it's a tough one.
and you know, like I feel like this may sound a little harsh, but you know, for me, like I need a certain number of people to do things their way or a different way to understand the difference between like sending the car to me or doing it yourself, right? I need you to understand that even though you've bought all of the same components that I would have put on here, it doesn't work properly, right? Because what I do with the components is the things that make it work, right? And tuning is I feel like, you know, proper tuning is like it's very underappreciated, right? And, you know, I hear guys complain about like, oh, you know, they want to charge me this much for a tune. Well, you know, it's not like the physical time somebody has to spend on that tune. It's like they spent years of their life like understanding like why they need to make things in your controller, you know, engine control strategy the way they need to be, right? And you're not going to go through that development process. You're just going to get a car that works and skip over where we find out that this much timing like takes the rod bearings out of it, right? You know, like
Yeah, like imagine spending 20, 30, 50,000 on an engine and then being mad about a couple grand in tuning
right.
is crazy because that's the key right there. And like it's not like the tune's just going to go bad. Like it's not a perishable item. If you don't change the car, it's just going to be there forever. And Alpha, who tunes my car, he always posts like messages from people of like, you know, you tuned it 2 years ago and now all of a sudden it's having this weird issue.
Sure.
And he's like, well, the tune didn't expire.
Yeah,
maybe your injectors are dirty.
I've had guys call and they go, is there any way it could lose the tune? And I said, well, if it lost my tune, what tune did it find? Right? Like what, you know, like it can't leak out.
It's
right?
running, but it lost your tune.
It can't lose the tune. And, you know, like to me, like the word tuned even is like very vague, you know, like
Yeah.
when is a car ever tuned to the point where I'm never going to connect a laptop to this thing ever again, right? I mean, another great example, you know, Brett's car, right? Does it work? It works pretty good. Are they ever going to make a pass on that car ever and not change something?
Yep.
Not a chance, right? It's something is going to change every single time that car goes down a racetrack. So, you know, like there's tuning, you know, like, I mean, you put it on the dyno and like by the time you're done on the dyno, as far as I'm concerned, you're just ready to go to the racetrack and start tuning that thing for like the real world.
Yeah. I mean, even my car, when it was on the dyno, made like, 40 pounds of boost, go to the track, make 60, make 50. Right. Like, it doesn't even, you don't even think about that aspect. It was good.
Yeah.
And then you just kind of scale up from there.
Which is, like I'll get guys and, okay, my car ran this. How much power does it make? And that's like I get to be like a pain in the butt with that. I'm like, well, a lot of times, honest to God, I don't know because I just take my car, I put it on the dyno, I make sure it works, and then I go to the track and like I get from the dyno to like, you know, where I am now without ever going back. Like if I go to the track and I add 5 pounds of boost, I don't put it back on the dyno to see what it made.
Yeah.
Right. You know, because to me, like horsepower isn't really what you're after. Like what you're after is the measured performance.
And mile per hour doesn't lie. If I see somebody's
Right.
mile an hour and I kind of know what their car weighs, you can
Right.
get a rough idea, pretty close, what kind of power it's making.
Yeah.
Mile per hour does not lie. I don't care what it ETs, but if you want to know the horsepower, it's a
Right.
simple formula of weight and horsepower to horsepower.
Yeah, there's, you know, we all know what these cars kind of weigh. But I mean, ultimately, like, knowing how much power it makes, unless you're trying to, like, keep it under wraps so you can win some kind of dyno contest, why does it need to be... I mean, like, I see more need for it to be a secret, like, what the car runs, than how much power it makes.
Yeah.
Right? You know, like, if you're gonna go race somebody for money, it's important to know, like, what does that car run? Like, who cares how much power it makes? And
But even that, too, like, if I see somebody with a single 96 millimeter on an LS, like, I kind of know where the ceiling is.
don't tell me it makes 800 horsepower.
Like, yeah, and, like, don't tell me it makes, 3,000 either, because, like, I kind of know where the ceiling is on that
Right.
deal. Like, you can kind of know when you're around this stuff a lot. But, man, I'm going to wrap it up here. This was awesome. I hope to have you back on again because this was
man, I'd
really
love
fun.
to.
This was a good time. Guys, Heffner Performance everywhere. You guys have worked on everything. We hardly even scratched the surface of some of that cool stuff that you guys have
Right.
done. But go check them out on social media. There are plenty of racing. I'm sure you got some YouTube videos up as well of some stuff, right?
Not very many, but...
Not
yeah,
very many,
yeah.
but there's a YouTube channel. I'll put it all in the description. Thank you for coming on, man.
Thank you.
Guys, if you want to see him back, just leave a comment so we can know, and we'll see you guys next time.